Since the dawn of naval warfare, the primary threat to a warship was another one of its kind. The deadliness of a vessel was measured by the size of its guns or the thickness of its armor. In 1914, that all began to change, for we saw the first use of aircraft in an attack on an enemy ship. Once again, I'm partnering up with Brandon F. for a double feature on the Battle of Tsingtao. He'll be covering the more land-based and political aspects of this little-known battle, while I cover the air. Let's dive right into the story of the first time planes were used in naval combat. Most believe the first seaborne strike took place on Christmas Day in 1914, when seaplanes from HMS Engadine attacked a Zeppelin base. However, this is almost 3 months after a raid that took place in the Far East. Far away from the Western Front, the German naval base at Tsingtao, China, was home to the Imperial German Navy's East Asia Squadron. Now, by August of 1914, the majority of the fleet, which included 6 cruisers, had dispersed into the Pacific, but a small force of gunboats and an Austro-Hungarian cruiser remained. The protected cruiser, Kaiser and Elizabeth, was armed with 8 15cm guns, 2 of which were high-velocity, long-barreled variants. In addition to her main battery, she carried several machine guns, but as an aerial threat had never really presented itself, none of them were really in a configuration suitable to engage aircraft. The aerial threat came from an unexpected enemy for World War I, the Japanese. Imperial Japan had sided with the Entente at the war's outset, and while they didn't possess the fighting capacity they would have in the following war, they elected to dispatch 23,000 men to take Tsingtao. On September 6th, after an airplane scouting mission determined the German strength within the naval base, an MF-7 biplane was launched from the Japanese seaplane carrier Wakamiya. Wakamiya has a hell of a background. She started life in Port Duncan in the UK, having been built for the Imperial Russian Navy as a transport. Initially dubbed Lethington, she was captured by the Japanese during the Russo-Japanese War and renamed Takasaki Maru. The name didn't last long, as in 1907 she was redubbed Wakamiya Maru. The Japanese Navy was interested in maintaining a fleet of newly created seaplanes, and Wakamiya was converted into a carrier in 1913, the first of her kind for the IJN. Wakamiya was equipped with 4 Maurice Farman 7 seaplanes built under license in Japan. The French-designed Maurice Farman 7 was a little more advanced than the frail experimental aircraft of the 1900s. She had no armament save for hand-dropped bombs that could only fly at about 59 miles per hour on a good day. Even so, the MF-7 evaded rifle and machine gun fire from the German warships and delivered her payload. Unfortunately for the Japanese, the hand-drop bombs all missed. Despite the lack of success, this would mark the first engagement between ships and planes, but the battle was far from over. On September 30th, Wakamiya struck a German mine and had to limp home for repairs. The seaplanes would remain in the theater, having been transferred to Laoshan Harbor to the west. From there, they continued the fight, primarily conducting reconnaissance for the Entente forces and dropping bombs on ground targets through November. Soon enough, Wakamiya's seaplanes would face an unexpected foe defending the Tsingtao Peninsula. The backbone of pre-war German air power was the Rumpler-Taube. A simple bird-shaped monoplane, the Taube was an even simpler design than the MF-7. They too carried no armament and, like their Japanese foes, were mainly used for reconnaissance. 2 Taube were delivered to Tsingtao in early 1914 and were crewed by naval lieutenants Friedrich Müller-Kowski and Gunter Plüschow. Müller-Kowski was severely wounded in a takeoff which destroyed his monoplane, leaving Plüschow as the lone aviator over Tsingtao. Before the conflict kicked off, Plüschow crashed himself after an engine failure. Gunter's wreck wasn't nearly as severe as his wingman's, and the Taube would fly again. Unfortunately, it needed to have parts sent from Germany. Said parts were found to be rotted in their crates, and as the war kicked off, replacements quickly became nigh impossible to ship. Any new wings or propellers would need to be manufactured locally. At the time, China didn't have the means to produce aircraft parts effectively, and the crude replacements often hampered the Taube's performance. Despite all the setbacks, in the fall of 1914, Plüschow did manage to get up in the air and perform recce for the German Navy. On several missions, he was able to evade Japanese anti-aircraft fire, which had as little effect as their Central Power counterparts. Every few flights, Gunter would pass by Japanese seaplanes, neither of which were able to engage each other. Things would change as the Japanese aviators began to bring pistols into the air. I've not been able to track down the dates of the engagements between Gunter and the Japanese pilots, but in late September, Plüschow was buzzed by an MF-7.
Einmal war ich in meiner Beobachtung ganz vertieft, als mein Flugzeug sehr stark anfing zu schlingern und zu stampfen. Ich dachte, es wären wieder einmal Luftstörungen, die durch die vielen steilen, schrofen Gebirge hervorgerufen wurden und ja das ganze Fliegen in dieser Gegend so außerordentlich erschwerten. Ohne also auszusehen, beobachtete ich weiter und erfasste nur mit der einen Hand das Hohensteuer, um das Flugzeug zur Ruhe zu zwingen. Nach meiner Rückkehr wurde mir zu meinem Erstaunen erzählt, dass eines der feindlichen Flugzeuge dicht über mir weggeflogen war. Und alles dachte schön, ich würde von diesem heruntergeschossen werden.
Some reports from the ground noted that the Japanese fired on Plüschow. Plüschow's own diary mentioned that he carried a parabellum pistol, better known as the Luger P08. In his words,
Das nächste Mal passte ich besser auf, und als ich einen meiner feindlichen Landkollegen dicht unter mir erblickte, verfolgte ich ihn und schoss ihn mit meiner Parabellenpistole mit 30 Schuss herunter.
30 times is a hell of a lot of fire coming out of a P08, which normally carries 8 rounds per magazine. The details of the dogfight aren't noted, but I imagine the Taube and MF-7 circled one another for minutes as the two pilots fired on each other. Plüschow would have to hold the Taube's stick with his knees and reload the Luger at least 4 times, only to take offhand shots at his enemy colleague. A true feat, if it's true at all. The German pilot claimed to wound or kill the Japanese pilot, sending his kite into a spiral and to crash into the countryside. The problem is that the Japanese Navy never reported any losses in their seaplane fleet over Tsingtao. There are 2 options. Number 1. The Japanese Navy could have lied to save face in the media. This happens quite a lot. Even today, militaries fudge their numbers or flat out deny losses to keep them from looking bad on the world scale. Then we have number 2. Gunter Plüschow lied. Another thing that comes up in air combat in particular is that aviators will over-exemplify their accomplishments. Even if he managed to hit the Japanese pilot who may have limped home unseen, he flat out states, "I followed and shot him down." Now, why would Gunter himself do something like that? Tsingtao itself was on its last legs, and the Entente siege sent the Germans running in all directions by November. Let's take a look at what happened after. This really paints a picture of what kind of man Lieutenant Plüschow was. Plüschow himself narrowly avoided capture, flying his Taube 160 miles before running out of fuel and crashing in a rice paddy. From there, he escaped to Nanking and traveled through the United States on a journey to make it back to Germany. He ended up being captured by the British as his transport ship docked in Gibraltar. From there, he was taken to London as a prisoner, but Gunter wasn't done just yet. During a violent storm, he escaped from the prisoner camp he was held at and jumped ship on the Channel ferry Princess Juliana, which was bound for the Netherlands. This, of course, made him the first and only prisoner to escape the British Isles in both World Wars. Upon returning to Germany, he was dubbed the Hero of Tsingtao and was a huge propaganda asset for the Empire. As part of the Hero package, he was given command of the Libau naval base in Latvia, and he wrote a book, The Adventures of the Aviator from Tsingtao. The autobiography went on to sell 750,000 copies in 1917, which was a massive moneymaker for the aviator. Don't get me wrong, Gunter had a hell of a story. But who would step in to discredit the Hero of Tsingtao by giving more accurate information? A national hero like him could say anything about Tsingtao's air campaign because he was it. He was the only pilot on the German side. The first verified aerial victory happened on October 5, 1914, when French pilot Joseph France and his gunner Louis Queneau shot down a German biplane on the Western Front. Gunter's engagement was supposedly in September of that year, which, if it happened, would make him the first pilot in history to achieve an air-to-air kill. This would further cement his name in history as well as help sell his books. Of course, it also made the German Empire look even better on the world stage. Had they won the war, of course. Sure, the Japanese had a reason to lie. but they at least had proof in that all their seaplanes were accounted for. Gunter Plüschow had a reason to lie, but he did so without needing any proof, because the only one who would dispute it was the enemy. So take that as you will. The Battle of Tsingtao was the first naval action that directly involved aircraft attacking ships. In the following years, aircraft were seen as an increasingly dangerous threat as technology improved. As aeroplanes grew faster and deadlier, a warship's arsenal would need to start including dedicated anti-aircraft weapons. By war's end, the light quick-fire guns were adapted to fire vertically and would further evolve in the interwar period. Planes would change the way warships fight and how they were destroyed. 20 years later, in the Second World War, we would see bombers striking decisive blows against the largest battleships in the world, including Bismarck and Yamato. In addition to fighting ships, this would mark one of the first air-to-air engagements in history, whether or not anyone was truly shot down in the hail of pistol fire. Plüschow would leave the German Navy in 1919 and become an explorer. Furthering his adventure repertoire by exploring Africa and South America, he would be killed in a plane crash near Brazo Rico in 1931. The plane he flew on his last flight was a Heinkel HD-24, nicknamed Tsingtao. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you're interested in the Siege of Tsingtao and want to learn more, check out Brandon F's video on the subject. It'll be linked in the description. Once again, I want to thank World of Warships for sponsoring this video. It really is a fun game, and I do personally recommend it, especially if you want to try out some of the early World War I cruisers similar to Kaiser and Elizabeth. Remember, you can use code BRAVO when signing up to get those 500 doubloons, 1.5 million credits, 7 days of premium, and that free ship. My patrons and YouTube supers are always to be thanked, of course, and I especially want to give a shout out to my Ace of Aces tier on Patreon. Thanks to The Administrator, Tico, Jake Fuentes, Chuck45, PecOps, InkyWeb, 50 Deuce, Hunter S, Chris Quinn, Weefy, FB, Zaku2, and Shockwave. It's the support that you guys provide that keeps these videos pumping out. I really appreciate any support from myself or of my partner Hellion, who works tirelessly to create assets for my videos. Oh yeah, and one more thing, it's been a while since I said this, but if you see that sun peering through the clouds, make sure you keep it at your back. Have a good one, fellas. Hey guys, Halloween is right around the corner and I just scored a backseat ride in an F-15D. It's kind of weird though, the guy who gave me the pass was standing at the entrance of a graveyard and didn't look anything like an Air Force officer. In fact, he was wearing all black and had a face paler than the moon. Also, he mentioned something about my time to cross over or something. Pfft, okay. Well, let's get to it. Yeah, that quick climb to 15,000 feet was pretty awesome, but you still haven't told me your name or where we're going. Hello? Oh, fuck. I mean, hi, I didn't know the Air Force was hiring Doolahans these days. Not that I have a problem with you guys, I mean, you know, some of my best friends are post-mortem Americans. Well, I've got some stories you might be interested in. They're pretty spooky. So last year I covered a few stories my dad told me about weird stuff happening to personnel at various bases. I've dug up a few more from whispers I've heard in my travels and of course clickbaity articles online. Recently, I took a trip to the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio with human Anglophile and YouTube powerhouse Brandon F.
Hi.
I find it's one of the only good reasons to go to Ohio, but what raised an eyebrow is how much supposed supernatural stuff goes on there. If you believe in that kind of thing. World War II, the most destructive conflict in human history, saw terror across the world and in the air. Some believe some of the terror lingers on some of the aircraft on display at the Air Force Museum. Rattles and clanks are often heard by museum staff and the B-24 Liberator's strawberry bitch. What? It's part of the name. You don't have to censor me for that. Fine. Some even claim to see shadows or lights moving about the bomber, as though crew members are still attached to the aircraft. What's eerie is that a crew member of Strawberry Bitch was killed during bombing raids in World War II. Flight engineer Staff Sergeant Ralph Krall was killed on a mission to strike targets in Bucharest on April 4, 1944. Of course, the circumstances of his death aren't penned in public record, but we do know that he was buried in Italy. Could his spirit still be in Strawberry Bitch, keeping watch over the bomber he served as flight engineer on? Speaking of B-24s, on display in the same building at the museum, you'll find parts from the lost Lady Be Good. Lady Be Good was a B-24D, much like Strawberry Bitch, which was also deployed to North Africa as part of the 376 bomb group. Her fate is even more grim than her intact sister. Due to a navigation error following a night mission, Lady ran out of fuel after overshooting her base near Benghazi. The crew survived the bailout, however they faced untold suffering over the next several days in the Sahara Desert. It wasn't until 1960 that their remains were found via an Air Force investigation. Lady Be Good herself was discovered in 1958 by British oil surveyors. Despite being in the desert for 15 years, she was in remarkable condition. The radio still functioned, the machine guns still fired, and it was all preserved thanks to the desert's dry climate and stable temperatures. Some parts on the aircraft were salvaged for use on other planes. However, some of these aircraft developed unforeseen problems. A C-54, which had a few transmitters from Lady Be Good installed, had engine issues and had to throw cargo over to land safely on a flight. Even worse, an Army DHC-3 Otter with an armrest from the bomber was lost over the Gulf of Sidra. Very few parts of the aircraft were recovered after the crash, but one was the armrest. Coincidence? Most likely. But there's a bit more to it. Even recently, museum staff have reported parts of Lady Be Good's display being rearranged. Parts sometimes have moved during the night with no clear cause in sight. Some shifty stuff there, fellas. In the next building over, you have a pitch-black CH-3E helicopter nicknamed Black Mariah. As part of Operation Pony Express, the black helicopter was used to transport indigenous soldiers in and out of Laos and North Vietnam. The unmarked helicopter was flown by Air Force crews lacking any patches or unit indicators. Now, obviously, flying into enemy territory is a dangerous task, let alone during the Vietnam War, with air defenses ranging from modern SA-2 missiles all the way to a peasant with a rifle. While much of Black Mariah's operations are still shrouded in mystery, she has numerous bullet holes and other signs of battle damage. Eerily, museum staff and visitors alike hear rustling and voices from within the helicopter. What's scary is that, due to the clandestine operations of the helicopter, we'll never know how many died inside her in the flurry of combat. Less than a mile from the Air Force Museum itself, you have Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. A base long rumored to house less than terrestrial technology in its infamous Hangar 18. And no, we're not talking about the Megadeth song. As the legend goes, wreckage from the Roswell UFO crash was taken there for storage and further experimentation in what was dubbed the Blue Room. Of course, there's not much actual corroboration to the legend. In fact, Hangar 18 doesn't even exist. Now, there is a Building 18 that tested engine components, so some UFO nuts probably put two and two together. Wright-Pat was home to alien technology of a different sort, however. Almost spookier, it was home to captured Japanese aircraft in World War II and eventually a MiG-15 which was tested and evaluated. Even today, Wright-Patterson is home to NASIC, the National Air and Space Intel Center. I've got a whole video in the works covering that stuff, so keep your eyes open for that. These are the guys who study enemy air threats, and even now, I'm sure their office holds darker secrets than any extraterrestrial invader could provide. That being said, if we ever did encounter an alien UFO threat, these would be the guys studying them, just as they do our Earth-based foes. So there we have it. Ohio has some shifty stuff going on in its Air Force Museum, and again, I do urge you guys to visit the museum if you get the chance. It really is a gem and worth the price of admission. Oh, the price of admission? It's free given it's a nationally owned museum. They're always looking to take donations though, should you want to support them. Once again, my loving patrons and YouTube members help keep me doing this kind of thing. I really appreciate the support. If you're interested in more aviation history, why don't you just hit that little subscribe button? You won't regret it. So anyway, where are we going? We're definitely not going to Ohio. Shit. We're going somewhere worse than Ohio. We're going to New Jersey. Sayonara, sucker. He's gone? Yo, did I just beat death? Dumbass didn't even curse his ejection seat. I love this month. October kicks ass. Just like I kicked your ass, Mr. Spooky. Maybe I should become a ghost hunter. Death, you've got nothing. I threw diamonds at the strip club beneath the Great Pyramids, man. You ain't got shit on me. Yo! Halloween, Halloween, Halloween! Halloween hams and hip-hop scams. Really quaint jams and shit.
If you're a fast jet pilot, you've got to be good, or you're dead. I mean, it doesn't matter which country you come from, because they've got to have bloody good reactions, they've got to be good. And the Argentinians, if you imagine, what are they, sort of racing drivers, polo players? I mean, what better sort of chap to have sitting in a fighter?
Over 40 years ago, an undeclared war raged in the South Atlantic. The British Empire unleashed its military might against the Argentine junta, pining for control over the small Falkland Islands. For Royal Navy flyers, this would be their first air-to-air combat, as carrier pilots of HMS Hermes and Invincible would tangle with advanced Israeli, French, and American-built fighters. Today, we're looking at how the humble Sea Harriers beat back the mighty Daggers, Mirages, and Skyhawks of the Argentine military. The Falkland Island chain, which lies about 300 miles east of South America, has been the subject of dispute between the British Empire and Argentina since the 1700s. The politics of the matter go a little outside of the scope of this video, and they get muddy as hell. I do recommend looking into it on your own, though. It's pretty interesting. I'll just do a quick rundown of the lead up to the conflict here. The British have had a permanent presence on the island since 1834 after a so-called reassertion campaign in 1833. Oh, you British have such beautiful ways to describe booting indoors. The island served as a commercial fishing hub, pit stop for Antarctic expeditions, and a military posting throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. A decisive naval victory in World War I came during the Battle of the Falkland Islands, in which the Royal Navy slapped the shit out of the German East Asia Squadron in December 1914. That's the same East Asia Squadron moored at Tsingtao, China just months prior. Check out my video on that if you haven't. The East Asia Squadron, commanded by Maximilian von Spee, lost 6 of 8 warships in a single day. Von Spee would go down with SMS Scharnhorst, the flagship. World War II would see a garrison of British troops building, with the 11th Battalion of the West Yorks keeping watch until 1944. It was then that the Royal Scots took over the defense of the Isles until war's end. The point is that even into the 20th century, Great Britain wasn't going to let any other armies set foot on the Isles. That is, until 1982. Argentinian President General Leopold Galtieri had taken over the country in 1981 and aimed to expand the nation's military power. He hoped that flying the Argentinian flag over the Malvinas Islands, as they called them, would build public support and keep his junta in power. By the early 1980s, the British Empire had fragmented, and the Argentinians did not expect that they would care about holding such a small and seemingly insignificant island chain. On April 2, 1982, Operation Rosario, the amphibious landings of the Falklands, took place. The small contingent of Royal Marines on the islands were captured, and the control of the islands fell to the Argentinians. Surely the British would come to a peaceful agreement and, maybe even turn the islands over. After all, it was 1982, and the UK had bigger military threats to deal with. Now, I'm an American with a tenuous understanding of British politics, but I do know that the British Empire had been granting independence to many colonies and even overseas territories post-World War II. However, none of the overseas territories had been invaded and forcefully taken over by another nation, only for the British government to play ball. Prime Minister Maggie Thatcher wasn't going to change that. A naval task force was organized with one goal: wrest control of the Falklands back from the Argentinians. At the core of the naval task force were carriers HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible. Hermes was a converted carrier, having originally been a conventional boat for operating fixed-wing aircraft. Since the 1960s, she had her catapult and arresting gear removed to make way for helicopter and vertical takeoff operations. Despite her age, she was large enough to support 12 Sea King helicopters and between 5 and 20 fighters depending on configuration. Invincible was the newer ship, having been built from the ground up to support Harrier vertical takeoff operations. While smaller than Hermes, she could still carry 8 fighters and 10 helicopters. The Argentine Air Force and Navy had at their disposal approximately 150 jet aircraft. While none could be based at Stanley Airport on the island itself, the Falklands were well within range of Argentina's air bases. In addition to land-based threats, the Argentine Navy possessed a carrier of its own, 25 de Mayo. 25 de Mayo, also known as the 25th of May, ironically enough started life as a Royal Navy carrier, HMS Venerable. A conventional catabar carrier, 25 de Mayo was equipped with the American-built A4 Skyhawk. The nimble A4 was already well seasoned, having seen combat in the Middle East and Vietnam. While it lacked sophisticated anti-ship weaponry like the Exocet missile, the A4's 8,000-pound bomb load alone could wreak havoc on a British warship or landing craft. The British would also have to face the Israeli-built Dagger, a modification of the French Mirage 5. The Mach 2-capable Dagger, or Nesher as it was called in the Israeli Air Force, was a deadly adversary. During the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Israeli pilots flying the Nesher claimed over 100 aerial victories. Hell, even English electric Canberras that were sold to the Argentine military 20 years prior were still a threat. The vast and modern Air Force would surely put up a fight, so what was the Royal Navy's response? The Sea Harrier FRS-1, also known as the Char, was a development of the Hawker Siddeley Harrier GR3 meant for maritime strike and fleet defense. Now, the Harrier series is one of legend. Its legacy goes back to the Hawker P1127 and later Kestrel prototypes. The Kestrel was the first practical jet-powered vertical takeoff and landing platform in history. Basically, it could operate without a prepared runway by angling thrust-vectoring nozzles downward to generate a lifting effect with its Pegasus engine. This would be a vital asset in any Third World War scenario in which most runways get destroyed. NATO loved the idea. The 1964 vintage Kestrel evolved into a production model, the Harrier GR1. The Harrier would end up being one of 2 jet-powered attack aircraft built by the British that the US would later adopt, the other being the English electric Canberra. Initially relegated to the Royal Air Force, the Royal Navy soon sought the vertical takeoff wonder as they began to retire their catabar carriers in the 1970s. In the wake of the Phantoms and Buccaneers, an opportunity came for British aerospace industries to fill the void. Introduced in 1978, the Char, as she would be known, was a beast in Harrier development. She had an improved cockpit over the earlier Harrier models in that it was raised for improved visibility. The FRS-1 was also equipped with a newly designed radar, the Ferranti Blue Fox. While it had trouble acquiring targets over land, it could pick up large sea-based threats at close to 100 miles and fighters at about half that distance. In addition to the upgrades, a modern heads-up display offered better situational awareness. That being said, the new system was not tested in combat and still had a few kinks to work out, as we'll see later. The Sea Harrier, while normally unable to break the sound barrier, could still fly at 600 knots in level flight and had a service ceiling of about 50,000 feet. The main cannon slung under the belly of the Char was the 30mm Aden cannon, but its primary air-to-air asset for self-protection was the new American Sidewinder variant, the AIM-9 Lima. The AIM-9L, unlike earlier models, was an all-aspect heat-seeking missile. Instead of relying on the engine exhaust alone, the seeker head could hone in on heat reflections and reject background clutter. Even if a pilot was head-on with an enemy fighter, he could lock on and shoot it up to 10 miles to get a kill. It was a true David and Goliath scenario, but in this case, David had a hell of a rock. The first Sea Harrier victories occurred on May 1st, 1982, when they shot down a Canberra and Mirage attempting to strike the British fleet, but they would be far from the last. A notable air battle occurred on May 21st, in which daggers from Air Mobile Squadron 3 ended up in a fierce dogfight with 2 Sea Harriers. Normally, the daggers would fly much higher and faster than the Harriers, but in this case, they had just struck HMS Brilliant. Because of their sea-skimming bombing tactics, they were low and in thicker air, the Harrier's playground. 2 Shars from 801 Squadron, piloted by Lieutenant Steve Thomas and Commander Nigel Sharky Ward, were vectored in to destroy the Argentine fighters. Ward had already claimed a Pucara, a light attack aircraft, earlier that day, and he and Thomas were seasoned pilots, with Ward having flown naval aircraft since the 1960s. 2 daggers were spotted down low, with one trailing higher than the other. Thomas broke off to engage the higher fighter, while Sharky dove to engage the other bandit. The first dagger was obliterated by Thomas's Sidewinder, turning it into a flying blowtorch. During the excitement, Sharky was surprised by the third, unseen dagger, which had slinted behind him. A burst of cannon fire narrowly missed the Shar, which pulled into a tight turn. The tighter turn radius let the Harrier creep inside the Delta Wing dagger zone, and it overshot underneath the nimble Shar. Immediately, Thomas dove down into the furball enveloping Sharky. A second missile ran off the rail and powdered another dagger. Now free from the immediate danger, Sharky's Harrier reversed its turn to re-engage his attacker. A simple hard pull-down brought the AIM-9 Seeker head to bear. A similar situation would play out less than a month later on June 8th. By this point, the 25 de Mayo had returned to port, as Argentine cruiser General Belgrano had been sunk by HMS Conqueror. This marked the first sinking of a vessel by a nuclear submarine in history. The Argentinians didn't want to lose their carrier as well, so their naval A4s were relegated to launching from land bases. This wasn't really much of a problem, however, as the Skyhawks could refuel in flight before or after making low-altitude runs on the fleet. Leading the air cover on the 8th were Lieutenant Commander David Morgan and Lieutenant Dave Smith of 800 Squadron. Upon arriving on scene at Bluff Cove, Morgan and Smith were faced with a grisly sight. Landing ships Sir Tristram and Sir Galahad were severely damaged by a flight of Argentinian aircraft. The burning hulks were easy prey to finish off, and the 2 Shars orbited above the Calamity to strike any incoming fighters. And they would come. 4 more Skyhawks were spotted running in for the throat. Morgan and Smith immediately rolled in to hit the A4s before they could deliver their lethal payload. The dive put the Sea Harriers over 700 knots, faster than the Pegasus engine was ever expected to push the birds. Pulling up, Morgan watched in horror as the lead 2 Skyhawks dropped their bomb load, with one striking Sir Galahad's stern. He could at least stop the trailing Skyhawks. Morgan lined up on the first bandit. The port missile locked immediately and flew straight and true. The 9L flew straight up the A4's tailpipe and detonated within the aircraft, vaporizing it. Morgan wasn't done yet. Despite the supersonic shockwave of the Sidewinder thrusting his Sea Harrier into a roll, he immediately recovered, ending up eyes on with a second Skyhawk, breaking left across his nose. For previous versions of the Sidewinder, this would be an impossible shot. Not so for the all-aspect Lima. The missile cut hard left, pulling lead on the braking A4. The Seeker of the Sidewinder compensated, and the expanding rod warhead sawed the little jet in two. The severed nose spun off to slam into the water. The third A4 came into view, a prime target for a guns kill, only for Morgan to realize with horror that the Char's HUD and gun sight had gone out. Nevertheless, Morgan tried taking a shot. As tracers struck the water around the Skyhawk, Morgan's wingman, Smith, called for him to pull up and clear the way for his own Sidewinder shot. Smith, after Morgan by several miles, fired his Sidewinder near its maximum range. Despite the motor burning out halfway to the Skyhawk, its momentum kept it on course. Another 3 aircraft fell to the Sea Harriers and their Sidewinders. By Complex N, 21 aircraft had been claimed by the Royal Navy pilots. Not a single Char was lost to enemy aircraft. There are many factors that go into a military victory, but I can say in good confidence that the Royal Navy won the air war via 3 distinct factors. 1. The AIM-9L Sidewinder was a technological marvel of the 1980s. Early Sidewinders were unreliable, having only a 10 to 20% success rate in Vietnam. This was due to the lackluster capabilities of the missiles and the limitations of having to shoot the enemy from behind. Of course, there were maintenance issues involved, and we'll get into that at some point, especially when I cover the alt report in Top Gun. Regardless, the 9L changed everything. Through its improved seeker head and rocket motor, it was able to track enemy aircraft pulling almost 90 degrees across its nose. 27 AIM-9Ls were launched in the Falklands War and 24 struck home. This is an almost 90% success rate just 10 years after Vietnam. Number 2. The Sea Harrier, while lacking the supersonic and high-flying capabilities possessed by the Daggers and Mirages, was a rather advanced aircraft for the day. Despite the teething issues regarding the Blue Fox and its avionics, the FRS-1 was still extremely capable and was a nimble dogfighter. Now, I know some people are going to talk about Harriers using their vectored thrust nozzles to achieve what is called VIFing, which is also known as vectoring in forward flight. This would allow the Chars to perform almost gravity-defying turns. Now, I've found very little evidence of this being the case. A good majority of the air-to-air kills involve Chars diving and using their energy to keep pace with the Argentine fighters. Their tighter turning and level flight alone was enough to keep an edge over the Delta-winged fighter bombers. And when it comes down to it, it was just an all-around good subsonic fighter at low altitude. Which brings us to 3. The pilots were well trained in the capabilities of the Harrier. For years they had participated in NATO exercises where they could practice dogfighting against an array of aggressor aircraft. They would never try to climb up to meet the Argentinian Delta fighters at altitude, instead making their attacks at low altitude where they excelled. It's that simple, really. The British pilots were good and brought the best out of their little VTOL jet. And that's where we're going to end this. The Sea Harrier, with various upgrades, served until 2006, but its spirit lives on. The F-35B is the premier NATO VTOL-capable fighter, and it's taken up the role of the Royal Navy's big stick on their Queen Elizabeth-class supercarriers. There's still so much one could learn about the Falklands conflict, and as I said before, I urge you guys to delve into the bigger picture. Once again, I want to thank all of my patrons, in particular my Ace of Aces tier. Special thanks to Zaku2, Shockwave, FB, Weefy, Chris Quinn, Hunter S, 50 Deuce, Pecops, Chuck45, Jake Fuentes, Tico, The Administrator, and Iron. If you enjoyed the video, I do hope you subscribe and ring the bell for notifications. I've got a lot more cool stuff coming. Keep that sun at your back, guys. Have a good one. There are few aircraft in history that have shaped the world of modern air combat much like the F-4 has. While designed for killing bombers, the F-4 would end up becoming the premier multi-role fighter of the free world. From Germany to South Korea and Japan to Iran, the F-4 was one of the most heavily dispersed American-built fighters in history. I'm Falcon, and today we're taking a trip down memory lane in anticipation for Heapler Simulation's release of the F-4E. She went by many titles: St. Louis Slugger, the Lead Sled, the Rhino, but the world over knows her by her original McDonnell Ghost fighter name, the Phantom. The F-4 Phantom has her origins just after the Second World War. The McDonnell Aircraft Corporation in St. Louis, Missouri had spearheaded the naval jet age with their F-H Phantom and F-2H Banshee. Both were conventional straight-wing jet fighters following many of the conventions held over from World War II. The Banshee would see extensive service in the Korean conflict, however its conventional design put it at a disadvantage when put against the swept-wing MiG-15. The more advanced land-based F-86 took on the role of keeping MiG-alley MiG-free, relegating the Banshee to a ground attack role. Post-Korea, the primary threat to American carrier fleets came in the form of long-range maritime patrol bombers like those of the Tu-95 Bear family. A new type of fighter was needed for the threat. An aircraft that could launch from the boat, fly at high speed to intercept the threat, track it down with its own radar system and shoot it down. All this while keeping the bombers outside of range of their own anti-ship missiles. Thus, the Fleet Air Defense Mission was born. In 1956, McDonnell put out the F-3H Demon, which was a vast departure from their previous jets. Unlike the other Ghost fighters before it, the Demon was equipped with swept wings, a single afterburning J-71 turbojet engine, and a modern fire control system to sling the new Sparrow and Sidewinder missiles. As modern as the Demon was for its day, she still had some issues to iron out. For one, the F-3H had a very low thrust-to-weight ratio, which meant that thrust put out by the engine was minuscule compared to the hefty airframe. The engine also had a slow throttle response time. That was a problem that plagued many jet aircraft of the period. Now we have to talk about how quickly technology was advancing in this time period. In modern times we have frontline airframes dating back 50 years, and it seems insane to have such a quick turnover of planes. But back in the day things were different. Literal days would make the difference in whether or not a fighter was new or obsolete. For example, the F-11F Tiger built by Grumman was only in service for about 5 years at the fleet before being replaced. The changeover was that fast. To give you a comparison, this would be like if the F-35C, which was operationally introduced to carriers in 2019, was taken off the decks and sent to the boneyard this year in 2024. So going back to the 1950s, the Navy was searching for a new attack aircraft to replace the propeller-driven AD Skyraider. While the Demon was far from perfect, McDonnell proposed a so-called modular Super Demon. The idea was that it could be built in various configurations for attack, fleet defense, or reconnaissance. The Navy seemed interested, however they would end up purchasing the Douglas A-4D Skyhawk for attack and the Vought F-8U Crusader for air combat. The Crusader is a favorite of mine, don't get me wrong, but it was really intended to fight other fighters still versus, going out long range to attack bombers. The fleet air defense role was still to be filled. The air defense role is a really tricky one. Soviet maritime patrol aircraft could operate in all conditions to launch their cruise missiles, be it in a raging storm or a moonless night. A replacement for the Demon would have to engage these bombers with radar-guided missiles in whatever conditions were at play, a feat the Crusader just couldn't do. So the new interceptor would need the following: a reliable and powerful engine, a pulse Doppler radar capable of painting targets at long range, and room to carry numerous Sparrow and Sidewinder missiles. McDonnell went to work, and they adapted their Super Demon concept to the specifications. The newly dubbed YF-4H was rolled out in 1958. She was a unique build, departing from the old dark blue painted Navy fighters of old. Instead of flat wings, a 5-degree dihedral was applied to the outer half to aid in lateral stability. Her horizontal tailplane followed suit in a 23-degree decline, giving the front aspect a look unlike any other aircraft. The fuselage of the YF-4H was, to put it lightly, a brick. I really don't know how else to describe it. But even a brick can fly if you throw it hard enough. 2 J-79 turbojets were buried in the lower part of the fuselage, and they provided almost 18,000 pounds of thrust with afterburner. Another break from the norm came in the crew arrangement. Most other Navy fighters of the day had just one pilot, but McDonnell reckoned a second crew member would be more suited to operate the complex AN/APQ-50 radar. Crewmen assigned to the slot would be dubbed radar intercept officers, and they would free up the pilot from having to devote attention to the radar, leaving them to their flying unimpeded. Several names were proposed for the YF-4H, including Mithras and even Satan to follow McDonnell's supernatural namesakes. Given this was the 1950s, the company decided to just settle with the more conservative Phantom II to honor their first jet. On May 27th, the new St. Louis Ghost Fighter was ready to take off for the first time. The intention was to break the sound barrier on the maiden flight, but faulty hydraulic components prevented the veritable flex. Despite the setback, the Navy was interested in the design. Competing with the Phantom II was the Vought F-8U-3 Super Crusader. While a strong competitor, the Super Crusader lost out as the Phantom had a larger payload and a more redundant engine arrangement. The Navy also found that the workload for the Super Crusader's radar and fire control system was much more labor-intensive for a single pilot than the Phantom's 2 crewmen, who could split the flying and fighting duties. Thus, on December 17, 1958, McDonnell's YF-4H was selected as the new king of the carrier deck, having been redubbed F-4H. The first F-4H squadrons would receive their Phantoms in 1961, with VF-74B Devilers becoming the first squadron to deploy on the USS Forrestal in August of the next year. The Phantom quickly became beloved by its crews for its reliable engines and better carrier handling than previous jets. Not only was the F-4H robust, it was fast. Project Sageburner in 1961 saw the Phantom maintaining an average speed of 902 miles an hour at less than 125 feet over a 3-kilometer course. Another record was broken in a time-to-climb challenge known as High Jump. On April 4th, 1962, the McDonnell Marvel peaked at 98,425 feet in under 372 seconds. God damn, this thing is awesome. The Phantom wouldn't be exclusive to Navy service for too long, because this is around the time when SecDef Robert McNamara was starting to put his fingers into military affairs. A former CEO of the Ford Motor Company, McNamara took a very business-oriented approach to military procurement. He figured he could slash excess costs by reducing different equipment being issued among various branches. Now, on paper, this makes sense. The same boots, belts, and uniform patterns for all branches? Yeah, I could see that working. It's when you start applying the same philosophy to bigger toys that it gets complicated. Like when you try to develop an aircraft for every branch that is supposed to do every job under the sun while maintaining as much parts commonality as possible. I'm looking at you, F-111 program. But now we're getting off track. McNamara wasn't just about developing inter-service equipment, he also wanted to push for pre-existing kit to be spread among branches. In the early 1960s, the US Air Force had a multitude of interceptors and fighters in service. With the turnover rate of aircraft being what it was in the time period, it isn't senseless to have the Air Force try their hand at a Navy jet that was shattering records almost every month. Now, if you'll indulge me with another tangent, McNamara also changed how aircraft are designated. Prior to 1962, the Air Force and Navy had completely different naming conventions for their aircraft. Let's take the B-25 Mitchell, for example. This was a World War II bomber that saw service in both the post-war US Air Force and Navy. On paper, they were considered different aircraft, with the Air Force maintaining the B-25 designation and the Navy calling their Mitchells PBJs. Pre-1962 naval conventions were a bit complicated. Well, to be frank, in my opinion, it was a f***ing mess. Most aircraft were designated with 2 to 4 characters, typically ending in a code letter for the manufacturer. Then you'd often shove a number into the end to differentiate submodels. Each manufacturer would have their own line of aircraft. If we look back at the Douglas attack aircraft post-World War II, we have the letters A and D for Attack and Douglas. AD. Then if you had a later model of the AD, you'd plug in a number like 2, 3, 4, etc. Now when Douglas would have to put out a completely new attack aircraft, they'd put a number between the A and D to give us wonders like A2D1 Sky Shark, A3D2 Sky Warrior, and the A4D5 Skyhawk. Honestly, the Air Force naming convention was easier to keep track of on the books. You would have an aircraft type, then the numerical designation of which plane it was. The manufacturer would just be omitted and improved models of the aircraft would gain the designation a letter at the end. When McNamara started the new naming convention, he changed every naval aircraft designation over from 0 but left the Air Force designations as is. Whenever feasible, the designations were kept as close to their old Navy monikers as possible. So if we go back to the Douglas aircraft example, we see the following changes. AD became the A1, A3D became the A3, and the A4D became just A4, with the numerical denomination shifting to according alphabetical letters. The same treatment was applied to fighters in the Navy. The North American FJ Fury became the F1, the McDonnell F2H Banshee became the F2, and the F3H became the F3. You get the gist. The F4H was in a momentary limbo, however, for while the Navy's F4H1s became the F4B, some were sent to the Air Force for trials under the designation F110. So does that mean the F4 was also kind of a Century Series fighter? Nah, I'm just making my brain hurt. In the end, the F-4 moniker stuck for all services. The F-4B would only need minor modifications for the Air Force. Primarily, the refueling probe for towed baskets was traded out for a boom system, and the catapult bridle hooks under the wings were fared over. The Air Force F-4 also included full flight controls in the back. The RIO, redubbed WIZO, or Weapons System Officer, could fly the F-4 just like the pilot if needed, be it an emergency or a training event. Now, a lot of folks say that the Naval F-4's landing gear is beefier than the Air Force model to handle carrier landings, but that isn't exactly the case. The Air Force's undercarriage is extremely similar to the Navy's, but the differences come in the main wheels themselves. The Air Force had wider, but with lower pressure tires for the varieties of landing strips the Phantom would have to operate from. On May 27, 1963, on its first flight, the first F-4C off the line punched past Mach 2, in my opinion making up for McDonnell's initial failure to go supersonic on the first go in '58. So there we have it. The F-4C for the Air Force and the F-4B for the Navy, and yes, the Marines adopted it too. The F-4 quickly became the US military's big stick, seemingly ready for any challenge from the communists. Right? Oh boy. While we never technically declared war on North Vietnam, I can't call an event that ended the lives of over 1 million people on both sides a mere conflict. It wasn't good for anyone, be they American, Australian, Vietnamese, or the people of Vietnam's neighboring countries. I'm not even going to touch the political ramifications of Nam, but just for reference for those not in the know, the North was supported by the Soviet Union and China, and the South was supported by the United States. Going into Vietnam, the F-4 was the most advanced fighter in the world. Hell, it was a record breaker, armed with the cutting edge in radar and missile technology. When it wasn't expected to tangle with Soviet-built MiGs, it could still be counted on to drop bombs on ground targets. At the outbreak of the war, North Vietnam only had 24 MiG-17 Frescos. The MiG-17, also known as the J-5 under license by China, was an upgrade of the infamous MiG-15. The Fresco was armed only with a battery of cannons and lacked the modern fire control suite afforded to the F-4. The Navy and Air Force didn't see the antiquated fighter as much of a threat, especially since the North Vietnamese pilots were expected to be rookies with little flight time. Even China's Air Force, which was in theater to aid the North Vietnamese, weren't expected to put up much resistance either. April 9, 1965 would pit the Phantom against the Fresco for the first time. A 4-ship flight of F-4s of VF-96 Fighting Falcons launched on a combat air patrol near Haiphong. Among the pack was Showtime 602, an F-4B flown by Lieutenant Junior Grade Terrence Murphy and RIO Ensign Ronald Fegan. Now, Murphy and Fegan were replacement aircraft for another that had crashed on takeoff, so they were separated from the rest of the Showtime birds. Trailing them was another F-4 flown by Lieutenant Don Watkins. Before Watkins could rejoin Murphy, he heard him report 3 contrails, no doubt communist MiGs. Details on the engagement are scarce and still mostly classified, but Murphy and Fegan scored a kill on a MiG-17, later identified to be of the Chinese PLAF. This would be the Phantom's first air-to-air victory, but as the Americans returned to their carrier, they found that Showtime 602 was missing. It's unclear what happened to Murphy and Fegan, with some reports stating another of the MiGs was able to gun their Phantom down. There's also talk of accidental friendly fire being involved, but neither story has been truly confirmed. June 17th saw Lou Page and J.C. Smith from VF-21 taking down another MiG-17 in the first truly confirmed victory against the North Vietnamese Air Force. As the war progressed, the F-4, while able to maintain superiority over the MiGs, barely held the torch. On June 20th, 1965, an F-4C of the 45th Tactical Fighter Squadron was shot down by a MiG-17, with Captains Paul Carey and Kurt Briggs successfully ejecting. This would be the Air Force's first loss to the Frescos. So what the hell was happening? Surely the more advanced F-4 should have been able to wipe the floor with the MiGs, but the exchange rate was almost 1-to-1. And yes, we will cover Robin Olds in the legendary Operation Bolo, don't you worry. I've heard a lot of people attribute the lack of F-4 success to the sled not having an internal cannon and having to rely on missiles. And what I have to say to that is, kinda. The F-4 was designed for long-range engagements where their Sparrow missiles would reach out and touch someone. Unfortunately, Vietnam's rules of engagements required visual identification of enemy aircraft before shooting in order to reduce friendly fire. Now this is for good reason, as identification of friend or foe, or IFF, did exist at the time, but it wasn't exactly perfect and not every American aircraft had it in theater. The F-4s would have to get in close, make sure their targets were hostile, and then take shots. But by that point, you were inside the MiG's own weapon envelopes, and let me tell you, the F-4 was a big target. Okay, so even if you're in close, you could still shoot, right? Well, maybe. If you could get onto the ass end of a MiG and radar lock in a mountainous jungle environment versus a flat ocean. Oh, I forgot to mention, Air Force and Navy pilots didn't train to dogfight in Phantoms, given their primary jobs were to kill bombers, so... Okay. Even that aside, let's just say for a moment that you had everything lined up. Everything was good to go to wax a MiG. You're about 2 miles behind in a straight line because older generation missiles couldn't follow a turning target well. And you take a shot. No, screw it, you're hungry. You want to paint a MiG on your nose, so you take 3 shots. 1 missile drops off and doesn't ignite. 1 ignites but ends up tracking the sun and fucks off. The 3rd hang fires and the rocket motor burns the belly of your Phantom. I know air-to-air missilery was less than 10 years old, but it really did fail a lot early on. 1968 was the worst year for American air crews, for North Vietnamese pilots now in possession of the MiG-19 and 21 achieved an adverse kill ratio. For 18 American losses, only 5 MiGs were shot down. Absolutely dismal. Between July and November 1968, Navy Captain Frank Ault created the Report of Air-to-Air Missile System Capability Review, in which he delved into why none of our goddamn missiles were working. The whole report is available online and I recommend reading up on it, but in short, missiles were poorly treated when in storage and pilots weren't firing them in the proper envelopes. The issue was not the F-4 itself, which was being thrust into a fight it wasn't meant to take on to begin with. The Navy and the Air Force both went to work to mend the problem. First thing first, both services improved their missile care. The Air Force also created a gun pod as a backup to faulty missiles just in case, then ordered the F-4E, which contained an internal Vulcan cannon. The F-4E was based on the RF-4C reconnaissance variant. In short, McDonnell, now merged with the Douglas Aircraft Company, modified the long nose to contain an internal cannon slung below the smaller but improved AN/APQ-120 fire control radar. Air Force successes did improve, and several gun kills were achieved, including a supersonic gun kill of a MiG-19 performed by Major Phil Handley. Now, the Navy took a completely different approach. Instead of the cannon being a band-aid fix for the poor missile implementation, the US Navy formed Top Gun with the goal of bringing out the best in their pilots. There's this idea held by experts like the late Pierre Sprey that the dogfight centers on close-in turning capabilities and little more, but what's actually more important are mastery of aircraft systems, weapons, and tactics to employ the fighter to its best ability. Now, I'm not going to say a P-51 is going to beat an F-35 just because the P-51 pilot is able to fly to the edge and bring the best out of his plane, but I will say that understanding the capabilities of your fighter coupled with superior tactics is a hell of a lot better than just strapping a gun onto the belly. Despite what the holy scriptures of the 1986 film of the same name suggest, the real Top Gun isn't some kind of trophy-winning contest for the top pilots in the Navy. Instead, Navy squadrons would send their most professional and promising air crews to Miramar, California. There, they would undergo a syllabus and learn enemy aircraft strengths and weaknesses. At the same time, they would be taught important tactics to best employ their weapon systems and beat said enemy fighters. Sometimes, they would have a chance to train against the real thing. Captured MiG-21s and MiG-17s were commonly flown over the Nevada desert out of Area 51. But that's a story for another time. After graduation, they would return to their squadrons and pass on the knowledge they learned to their fellow pilots. Skip forward to Operation Linebacker 2 at the tail end of the war in 1972, and there was a dramatic change of pace. In that year alone, Navy Phantoms scored 24 air-to-air kills, almost half of the 57 Navy victories claimed in the entire war. Now, the Air Force claimed 48 kills in 1972. While that's a higher number, they still lost 24 Phantoms to enemy aircraft, totaling a kill ratio of only 2 to 1. The Navy, by comparison, only lost 6 to MiGs. And don't think I'm trying to bash the Air Force here, but the different philosophies really were put to the test, and the results were clear. While Vietnam was the F-4's rite of passage, it is by no means the end of its tale. In fact, most Phantoms we know today were built on the lessons learned in that terrible war. Even as far back as 1963, the F-4C was sent overseas to the Outback in an attempt to export the sled to the Aussies. It didn't pan out, and Australia would end up picking up the F-111, but they would still play around with the sled as late as the 1970s. It wasn't until the next year, 1964, that the UK formally adopted the Phantom for both naval and Air Force purposes. While it didn't spend too much time on Royal Navy carriers, it still served as a throbbing dick of the fading empire. The F-4K, as the McDonnell Douglas boys called it, was powered by Rolls-Royce Spey turbojet engines. The engines, coupled with a Ferranti radar, made this Phantom, dubbed FG-1 by the UK, an American frame with a British heart. It truly became its own beast and served into the late 1980s when the tornado laid it to rest. And it wasn't just the UK and Australia that had the F-4. Egypt, Germany, Greece, Iran, Israel, Japan, Korea, Spain, and Turkey would all use the F-4 in various configurations. The St. Louis Slugger truly became a worldwide phenomenon. The Phantom saw extensive combat with the Israelis, busting caps in 66 enemy aircraft between 1969 and 1982. And would you believe it, the F-4 still sees service with the Hellenic, South Korean, and Iranian air forces to this day in 2024. That's almost 70 years of service. Not bad for a humble carrier fighter originally built for fleet defense. The Phantom evolved into a versatile platform, taking on every duty from dropping bombs, busting SAM sites, and was even built in a reconnaissance configuration. It's no exaggeration to call the F-4 the premier multi-role fighter of the free world. As for me, I'm in talks with this fella near me who owns a fully restored F-4 cockpit. He's already made the grave mistake of giving me the okay to film it come springtime. So next time I talk about the trusty F-4, we're going inside the hatch. Let's welcome 2024 as the year of the F-4. If you want to support further endeavors such as this, I'd love to get more patrons. Believe me, you won't regret it, and it really helps me out a lot. Special thanks to my Ace of Aces tier: Saku2, Shockwave, FB, Weefy, Chris Quinn, Hunter S, 50 Deuce, Pecops, Chuck45, Jake Fuentes, Tico, and the Administrator. You guys are the bomb. Until next time, gang, keep that sun at your back. Phantoms forever. The Dart, the missile with a man in it, the Widowmaker. All these titles have been applied to an iconic aircraft built by the Lockheed Corporation. It was notorious for being a difficult jet to fly, and for how many pilots it took down with it. But is there more to the stubby-winged jet than we give it credit for? Was it really that bad?
God damn it, Mr.
Alright, you're gonna have to hear me out on this one. I'm gonna be that guy and stand up for the F-104 Starfighter and what it contributed to aviation history. I'm not gonna pretend it's the best thing ever, but believe me, there's more to it than meets the eye. I'm Falcon, and today I want to cover the hows and whys of the F-104 Starfighter. To really understand the story of the plane the internet loves to hate, we have to discuss its designer, Clarence Kelly Johnson. Johnson had been the chief designer of the Lockheed Aircraft Corporation since 1938, with notable creations including the P-38 Lightning and the P-80 Shooting Star, the first jet fighter widely adopted by the Army Air Force at the tail end of World War II. Calling Kelly a visionary is a bit of an understatement. As he helmed the Lockheed Skunk Works, the company's advanced development department, he envisioned some pretty crazy shit in addition to the world-famous planes that actually materialized. For example, what would become the P-80 was originally dubbed the L-133. The 133 was a radical design, especially for 1940. Intended to be propelled by two L-1000 turbojets, This was a whole year before British inventor Frank Whittle would complete the first practical jet engines accessible to the Allies. It featured a unique canard arrangement and a fuselage that blended into the wing for more efficient airflow. And again, I want to emphasize, this is back in 1940, before the Gloucester Meteor and the Me-262. And hell, we weren't even in World War II yet. The US Army, of course, saw it as too radical, hence the creation of the more conventional P-80 later in the war. So that gives us an idea of what Johnson had buzzing around in his head. Let's fast forward to the Korean conflict. Johnson spent some time in Korea talking with fighter pilots about their experiences and their desires for future combat aircraft. You see, in the early jet age, fighters were tangling not at 20 to 25,000 feet as they were in World War II, but sometimes pushing up to 10,000 feet higher. With the higher altitude also came higher speeds. While the F-86 Sabre maintained a positive kill ratio over the Soviet-built MiG-15, the cruel truth is that the lighter and smaller MiG had a higher top speed and rate of climb. Sure, the F-86 could catch a MiG in a dive and our pilots' superior training gave them an edge, but Johnson took the deficiencies to heart as he moved to design what was intended to be America's next premier day fighter. With that, I do want to mention there were two schools of thought in fighter design at the time. Day fighters like the Sabre and F-9F Cougar, and more complex all-weather interceptors like the F-3D Skyknight and the F-102 Delta Dagger. Now that's a gross oversimplification of a very complex topic, but it isn't like now where one multi-role aircraft can fight at any time of day in any conditions. Day fighters centered tactics around dogfighting visually, typically with guns and short-ranged missiles, and used their crude radars for ranging their guns and the like. All-weather aircraft relied heavily on radars to search and track enemy aircraft, but typically were not suited for dogfighting. Again, an oversimplification, but for all intents and purposes, Kelly Johnson's next design was intended as a day fighter with an emphasis on speed and high-altitude performance to kill other enemy fighters. By 1952, Johnson presented his concept to the Air Force, who took great interest in the project. The proposal saw competition in the form of North American, Republican Northrop, but Lockheed's L-246 design was selected. Following Lockheed's convention of including stellar entities in aircraft titles such as the Shooting Star or Constellation, the L-246 was dubbed Starfighter. Allocated the designation F-104 by the Air Force, the Starfighter was built on information gained from the X-3 and X-7 test aircraft. Hundreds of artillery rockets were also employed to test various flight surface configurations. In the end, Skunkworks settled on an unusual trapezoidal wing canted downward to help with horizontal stability. Unlike other aircraft of the day, which stored fuel in internal wing tanks, the F-104's wings were extremely thin and effectively were bolted to the side of the aircraft. Also breaking the mold was its T-tail configuration, which was found to offer better control at transonic speeds. The narrow and long design of the aircraft looked like no other. It was made to simply stab through the air as fast as possible. A tight turning radius with extreme nose authority wasn't seen as important as maintaining energy in a high-altitude dogfight. The Starfighter's claim to fame was outclassing Soviet fighters on speed and high-altitude performance. Although, while its turning circle was wide because of the aircraft's light weight and high wing loading, the 104 could maintain high-speed turns surprisingly well. As long as it could stay fast, the Starfighter was to be a lethal opponent. Of course, to get fast and stay fast, you need a hell of a power plant. The newly designed General Electric J79 turbojet was slated to do the job. The 79 was a massive motor, spitting out over 15,000 pounds of thrust with afterburner. In an effort to satiate Korean War pilots' requests for improved firepower, the Starfighter was fitted with a 20mm Gatling cannon known as the Vulcan. The first of its kind fitted to a fighter, the Vulcan was superior to traditional machine guns in almost every way. The gun itself, which featured 6 barrels linked together, weighed only 300 pounds without ammunition. And given the gun was externally driven, it was almost impervious to jamming. Any unfired round or jammed casing would simply be spat out of the mechanism to make way for the next one. You want a flying gun? Move over A-10. The F-104 was the original flying buzzsaw. As it neared completion, the Starfighter was set to be the ultimate MiG killer, able to outclimb, outrun, and outshoot any of the MiGs in the Korean conflict. Unfortunately, things were about to get complicated. As the F-104 was taking its first flights, technology was rapidly advancing. The US Air Force was starting to look at missiles as a primary air-to-air weapon. In particular, the AIM-9 Sidewinder was coming onto scene, and the F-104 was upgraded to accommodate the new missile. And sure, that really wasn't a problem. I mean, new tools are good. As long as the Starfighter could maintain its original MiG-killing mission, everything would turn out just fine. Say hello to new multi-mission requirements. The Air Force also wanted the Starfighter to fill the bomber intercept job, which meant accommodating the massive Air-2 Genie air-to-air nuclear rocket. Yeah, you heard me right. Anti-bomber doctrine of the early 50s saw unguided rockets taking the place of guns on most all-weather interceptors. Everything from small 2-inch folding fin rockets to literal nuclear-tipped rockets were applied. The Starfighter, with its thin, long fuselage, was not the ideal platform for Genie rocket employment. The Genie required a large launch platform, lest the massive rocket motor burn away the jet's aluminum belly. A solution came in the form of a trapeze launcher that would sling the rocket down several feet to clear the aircraft. Only then would the rocket charge fire and throw the nuke downrange, ideally to burst within the formation of bombers. As the mission changed, other competitors built from the start as interceptors like the F-102 were quickly catching the Air Force's eye. To them, the idea of a day fighter was becoming less and less important by the day. Regardless, the F-104A Starfighter was accepted into Air Force service on February 20th, 1958. The US Air Force would become just one of many operators of the Starfighter. Let's delve into that next. As Lockheed was unable to corner the US Air Force market with the Starfighter, they turned to America's allies who were in need of a modern but relatively low-cost fighter. In 1957, the West German Luftwaffe was still trying to resurrect itself after a complete and total destruction by the Allies in World War II. With the threat of the Iron Curtain on its doorstep, the Luftwaffe sought out a modern, ready-to-go fighter to take on every duty from interception to ground attack. The needs of the Luftwaffe were presented to Lockheed, who stepped forward with their multi-role F-104G concept. The G model would include the following changes: a more powerful J79-11A engine, a larger tail also applied to the American F-104B and C for improved horizontal stability and control, improved flaps for better low-speed maneuverability, a larger drag chute to shorten landing distances, de-icing equipment for engine inlets, improved avionics including a new radar and inertial navigation system, and finally, the means to carry 3,000 pounds of external stores. Competing with the F-104 were the prototype English Electric P-1, which would later evolve into the Lightning, an upgraded F-11F Super Tiger from the Grumman Aircraft Corporation, the new Vought F-8U Crusader, and finally the Republic F-105 Thundersheet fighter bomber. Now, for a time, even the Saunders-Roe SR-177 rocket-assisted interceptor concept was a possibility, but that was written off pretty early in the competition. In the end, the F-104G was selected as all of the other competitors were still in development. The F-104 was basically ready to go from the outset. Germany wasn't the only nation to pick up the F-104G. Belgium, the Netherlands, and Italy also signed on to purchase the G. Including Germany, each nation would also manufacture the Starfighter indigenously under license. The F-104G was quickly becoming the go-to platform for NATO members, and while Lockheed's new fighter was left by the wayside in the US, the international market was quickly making up for their earlier shortcomings. Soon after, Taiwan, Japan, and Pakistan, among others, would also get behind the 104. Even Canada would produce their own Starfighter, the CF-104, in the mid-60s. Now, most of you know what would happen next. A lot of Starfighters crashed. Germany in particular suffered extremely high losses through the 1960s. Going over the Luftwaffe losses, I found that a good number of them are related to pilot error, be it contact with the ground during attack runs, losing control on landing, or departing control at altitude. The F-104 was designed for experienced American fighter pilots who, for some, had been flying since the early 1940s, all the way through World War II in Korea. The German Luftwaffe was built from the ground up as recently as 1956, full of rookie pilots whose only jet experience were very short stints in the more conventional aircraft like the F-86. Flying the Starfighter brought with it many challenges. As I said before, the F-104 could maintain turns well. But unlike today's fighters that can maintain high angles of attack, the Starfighter would easily lose control if the nose pulled too hard off its plane of motion. Angle of attack is, in layman's term, the angle at which the nose of the aircraft points away from the direction of flight. Modern aircraft can hold angles of attack in a turn from 30 to 40 and even sometimes 50 plus degrees. The F-104 was simply not built to do this, and if the angle of attack exceeded 15 degrees, the aircraft could violently pitch up and snap into an often unrecoverable spin. The disorienting pitch up and departure was extremely harsh on the pilots, who would often be unable to inject in time before hitting the ground if they were too low. Such accidents occurred during ground attack training, where if a student pilot got too low, they might accidentally yank the stick in an attempt to pull out. Even if a pilot was able to eject in time, the Lockheed C2 ejection seat, again more suited to high altitude use, wouldn't allow for a full parachute before the pilot hit the ground. The C2 was an older seat designed based on the original F-104's downward firing system. Yeah, you heard that right. The original firing seat didn't last too long for obvious reasons. Anyway, the C2 was not what we know as a 0-0 seat, requiring forward motion and altitude to get a pilot out. A 0-0 seat like the Martin Baker Mark 7 is rocket-propelled and can safely deliver an airman under parachute while a plane is still on the ramp, parked. Another F-104 unpleasantry was its high landing speed. Due to its stubby wings, the Starfighter had to come in for landing at around 175 knots in ideal conditions. For reference, that's only 15 miles faster than its stall speed, making for a narrow margin of error for an inexperienced pilot. Again, ejecting that low with the old C2 seat was not ideal. With 67 Luftwaffe F-104 losses by 1966, the German media labeled the F-104 as a Widowmaker. There were claims that the aircraft itself was unsafe and unsuitable for a modern air force. The new commander of the Luftwaffe in 1966, Johann Steinhoff, ordered all F-104s in German service to be grounded until a solution could be investigated. Steinhoff was a World War II flying ace, with 149 victories against the Soviets and 19 against Western powers. His World War II career was cut short when he crashed his Me-262 on landing and suffered severe burns over most of his body. Upon investigating the causes of Starfighter crashes, Steinhoff determined that the F-104 was relatively sound. However, German pilots were not adequately trained as their American or Italian counterparts. Steinhoff initiated a new training regimen which drastically reduced fatality rates. To address the ejection issue, the Martin Baker Mark 7 was installed, which further improved survivability. Even so, the German public still had a bad taste in their mouths regarding the Starfighter, and media being media continued to perpetuate the idea that the F-104 was a death trap, a label that still haunts the Starfighter community. Canada also suffered an extremely high loss rate. At the end of its 24-year service, the RCAF lost 113 Starfighters, almost half of their own 238-built Canadian F-104s. However, it is important to note that the Royal Canadian Air Force losses were, like with Luftwaffe, mostly due to pilot error and other outside factors like bird strikes. And now, a Canadian Goose is going to absolutely wreak havoc on an Orenda J-79, just saying. Also to note, the Starfighter's predecessor in Canadian service, the F-86 Sabre, suffered over 282 losses and 113 pilots killed, almost double the loss of RCAF's Starfighters in just a 12-year period. Now this might sound like a whataboutism, but I think it just highlights how hazardous the conditions over Canada are for all aircraft in general. Interestingly, the CF-104s were the most high-hour Starfighters in the world. At the time of retirement in the early 1980s, the average CF-104 had around 6,000 hours of flight time on it, versus 2,000 hours for similar German F-104Gs. Now, not to poke too hard at Canada, but overflying their aircraft seems to be an ongoing trend even today. Canada, just let your legacy Hornets rest, please. Often glossed over by Starfighter detractors is its actual effectiveness in combat, rare as it was. The US Air Force used the F-104 as a great deterrent over Taiwan during the 1958 Taiwan Strait crisis. With the 104s making Mach 2 runs up and down the strait, the Red Chinese never challenged the F-104s with their MiG-15s and 17s. The Taiwanese Air Force, impressed with the Starfighter's abilities, purchased several F-104Cs for their own interception duties. On January 13, 1967, two Starfighters piloted by Major Hu Xinlin and Captain Shi Beipo each scored a kill against a formation of PLAF MiG-19 farmers. While one F-104 from the Force ship ended up being listed as missing in action, the dogfight would prove that the stubby-winged dart of a jet could draw blood. 2 years prior, in the skies over India and Pakistan, Starfighters of the newly formed Pakistani Air Force would frequently tangle with the Indian Air Force's finest. On September 3, 1965, F-104As, nicknamed Griffins by the Pakistanis, were vectored to support a flight of F-86s that had been jumped by 6 Indian fallen Nats. Flight Officer Abbas Mirza of 9 Squadron and the lead Griffin rolled into the melee from 36,000 feet. One of the NAT pilots reportedly cried, as the attack on the Sabres was foiled. A second F-104, piloted by Flight Lieutenant Kam Durrani, singled out one of the NATs and forced it to land in Pakistani territory. Its pilot was then swiftly captured. 4 days later, on September 7th, an Indian Air Force Dassault Mystère, piloted by Commander Ajamata Davaya, tangled with a 104 crewed by Amjad Khan. While Khan's initial Sidewinder shot missed, a burst of cannon fire shredded Davaya's Mystère. Instead of ejecting, Davaya broke into the oncoming Starfighter and collided with it, only to then lose control and crash. Davaya was killed instantly. Khan, unable to maintain control of his now damaged F-104, was forced to eject. The Starfighter would later go on to claim a Canberra bomber. There, I said it right this time, Animarchy. And the F-104's victories would add to the Pakistani Air Force's kill ratio of 6-1 against India in the Indo-Pakistani War of 1965. The Vietnam conflict saw the Air Force employ the F-104 primarily as a bomber escort. There, it didn't perform as well as the Pakistani or Taiwanese F-104 counterparts. As I discussed in my F-4 video, American pilots had neglected to train in air-to-air combat by the mid-60s. As such, when the F-104 was deployed to Vietnam and it faced the newer generations of MiGs like the MiG-19 and 21, American pilots were caught lacking. No Starfighter victories were recorded, while at the same time, one F-104 piloted by Captain Philip Eldon Smith of the 479th Tactical Fighter Wing was shot down by Chinese Air Force MiG-19 cannon fire. He would bail out over the water only to be captured by a Chinese fishing vessel. Smith would end up being the only American airman to be a guest of the Chinese government during Vietnam. The American 104s would ultimately be ineffective, and 7 other Starfighters would be lost to ground fire. 2 would even collide during a combat air patrol in an attempt to recover Smith. As the F-4 Phantom was gaining popularity in tactical air command, all Starfighters were transferred to the Air National Guard by 1967, never to see combat for the US Air Force ever again. There's a veil of darkness in the Lockheed bid to disperse the F-104 that I've neglected to cover until now. In 1976, after an audit of Lockheed's spending, it was discovered that $22 million had allegedly been spent in bribes to foreign officials in an attempt to garner sales for the Starfighter. I won't go too deep into this as it is a very complex issue, but as an example, West German Minister Franz Josef Strauss allegedly received $10 million from Lockheed in 1961 to influence his purchase. Strauss denied the allegations brought up by former Lockheed employee Ernest Hauser, but when asked to present the documents detailing the Starfighter deal by the German government, they were found to have been destroyed in 1962. Pretty suspicious, I don't know. I won't doubt that the F-104 is a controversial aircraft. On one hand, it revolutionized how aircraft can be dispersed to allies and build international military strength, but on the other hand, it highlighted the dangers of taking a purpose-built machine and forcing it into other roles, as well as cementing the importance of pilot training the world over. If you want my opinion, using the F-104 as a ground attack platform is basically trying to eat soup with a fork. Now, despite that, the idea of the F-104 becoming a worldwide export fighter laid the carpet for later aircraft to be dispersed in a similar but more efficient manner, like the F-5 and F-16. Not only was the F-104 a valuable step in fighter aircraft evolution, it would go on to be an indispensable research platform. NASA used the 104 to great effect for everything from an X-15 chase plane to mounting heat-resistant tiles for the space shuttle. A few F-104s were also modified for high-altitude training and research for the US Air Force's astronaut school. Dubbed NF-104As, the custom Starfighter was fitted with a rocket motor to push it past 100,000 feet, where RCS thrusters on the nose and wings would take over to control the aircraft. The F-104 was not a perfect fighter, nor was it necessarily even great, but hyperbolic memes and concept albums are all derived from a basic misunderstanding of what a complex tale the F-104 itself was really just a cog in. And honestly, I really don't blame people for looking at the F-104 at face value. Once a reputation is applied en masse, be it true or not, it's hard to shake it. The average aviation enthusiast who isn't as hyper-focused as I would easily take the shit as they see it without looking into the whys or hows. The aforementioned scandal helped the uninformed media push through the idea that the F-104 was an intentionally poorly designed export interceptor to line its designers' wallets, which in my opinion just isn't really the case. That label goes with the MiG-23, but I have plans for that f***ing thing. The F-104 was not initially intended to be an export aircraft, and was the culmination of years of research in an ever-changing world of air combat. While innovative, the ins and outs of US Air Force doctrine changed before it had a chance to truly shine. Even so, many nations still ended up loving the F-104. Italy, for example, kept it flying until just 20 years ago in 2004, constantly upgrading it with newer avionics and weapons. Hell, they even got AIM-7 Sparrows working on it. Japan operated the F-104 from 1962 to 1986, all the while losing only 3 aircraft during its career. Their indigenous variant, the F-104J, was well liked by Japanese pilots who operated the aircraft in its original fighter role, while at the same time operating other aircraft types for dangerous ground attack and maritime strike missions. Speaking of countries with low starfighter loss rates, Spain never lost a single of their 21 starfighters, which served their air force well into the 1970s. Love it or hate it, the Widowmaker is a media nickname for the starfighter. No pilot wants to fly a Widowmaker, and thus they never referred to it as such. Less grim names were created by the pilots. The Dart, the Missile, Echo meaning glory, Badmash meaning the wicked one, and the Zipper, my personal favorite, were much more common among the pilots who put their lives on the line when they strapped on the F-104. I guess at the end of all of this, I want to leave you with the following. There's always another side to history, be it about the F-104 or aviation in general. Hell, I might have even gotten something wrong in this, of course, and if so, please leave a comment so I can learn something. Do your own research too, read some books, and come to your own conclusions. Keep that sun at your back now. Now then. Oh, Laser Pig, Laser Pig. I want you to repeat after me. Kelly Johnson did nothing wrong.
Okay, fine. Look, it's a decent plane. I changed my mind, okay? Look, we're friends here. We'll make a video together on it. It'll be fun. Let's not do anything too hastily, okay?
Is that the first season of Sex and the City on Blu-ray?
Hell yeah, that Samantha's a queen.
Okay, I'm in.
There's a base in the Nevada desert that, until recently, the Air Force denied existing. Tales of alien bodies, UFOs, and top secret technology have all been whispered about Groom Lake, better known as Area 51. Over the years, Groom Lake has been the place to go to test newly designed aircraft. It was here that stealth fighters and supersonic recon birds first took to the skies. The base was and still may be home for alien aircraft. No, not from space, but alien in the more terrestrial manner. Amidst the clandestine days of the Cold War, Area 51 was host to Soviet aircraft. While many Soviet fighters have operated from Groom Lake, today we'll focus on 3 individual fighters, each one surrounded by tales of espionage and defection. Sit back and relax as we delve into the first 3 MiGs sent to Area 51.
Fire rains down from high, and all the
Groom Lake's homey airport, more commonly referred to as Area 51 in the media, was originally built in the 1950s for the CIA to test top-secret aircraft, most notably the U-2 spy plane. The base was built over the small Indian Springs Auxiliary Field, which serviced the larger Indian Springs Airport, now known as Creech Air Force Base. Groom Lake was chosen for its salty, flat surface, which would offer a safe landing area for most aircraft. It also had the benefit of being far away from the public eye, being in the middle of the Nevada desert, but close enough to civilization to allow supplies and staff to be brought in. The origin of the Area 51 moniker is still up for debate, but CIA documents notably use the term as far back as 1967. For the sake of this video, I will be referring to Area 51 primarily as Groom Lake, however it has also been called Dreamland or Paradise Ranch. And on that note of secrecy, I want to introduce today's sponsor, ARA. Just like the Air Force protects its secrets, you should be able to protect your identity as well. I've been using ARA lately, and I'm absolutely floored at how easy it is to use and how effective it is at protecting my personal details. As someone who's had their bank account busted into in the past...
You had your bank account busted into?
Yeah, like 10 years ago.
Thought you were lying.
No,
for the sake of the ad.
No, I really did.
Oh.
As someone who's had their bank account busted into in the past, I really do wish I had something like ARA back then, and I'm honestly happy to be able to offer you guys a chance to use it too. Trust me on this one. Protecting yourself online now will save you a whole heap of trouble down the road. Ne'er-do-wells are always looking for innocent people to prey on, and you'll have a personalized shield with the services ARA provides. Click the link in the description below or go to ara.com/FalconsFighterTales for a 14-day free trial. Not only will you be able to experience peak online identity protection, it'll help me out too. Alright, let's get back to that desert. Through the 1950s and 60s, Groom Lake was home to both the U-2 and Blackbird programs. It was around this time that unidentified flying object reports began to rise. The U-2, flying at 60,000 feet in its silvery aluminum skin, would easily cast a bright glare miles away. Sunlight cresting over the Earth would reach the spy plane, while the land below it would be shrouded in darkness, creating an otherworldly apparition. The later Blackbird programs, which spawned the A-12 and SR-71, are also likely culprits for UFO sightings, as no other plane in the world looked like them at the time. The mystique of Groom Lake was built further into the 1970s and 80s during the development of stealth aircraft, which looked even farther from what one would expect an airplane to look like at the time. The media loved it. The base with its alien-looking aircraft was a prime target for documentaries, merchandise, and fanatical tales. I've heard people say that sneaking onto the base yields harsh punishments, including fines, arrests, and worse. Honestly, these claims are absolutely correct. Being a military facility, top secret or not, it's not surprising that security is of the utmost importance. Trying to sneak into Groom Lake would yield the same results as though someone were trying to hop into a fence at any Air Force base. You'd get your ass kicked, and I don't recommend trying it yourself. We can again thank the media for playing up the drastic security measures around the base. Gotta sell those bobblehead aliens. The Air Force did officially admit that the base exists as a separate facility in the 1990s due to a civil case involving extreme health problems suffered by staff members. I definitely recommend you look into the Kaza vs. Browner case from 1997 for more information on that mess. High-performance spy planes and stealth fighters weren't the only aircraft to call Groom Lake their home, however. 1953 was a big year for the Western world's aviation intelligence community. On September 21st, 1953, a lone MiG-15 flown by North Korean pilot No Kum-sok landed at Kimpo Air Force Base in the south. For the first time, the US Air Force had access to a fully functional MiG, the adversary that tested the skills of American aviators during the war. The aircraft was sent back to the US's Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, and trialed by none other than Chuck Yeager himself. That same year, a Yak-23 was tactically acquired when a Romanian Air Force defector landed in Yugoslavia. The Yak was turned over to the US and was also sent to Wright Field for evaluation. Given the nature of the acquisition, the Yak was flown at odd hours of the day to avoid any prying eyes. And eventually it was returned back to Yugoslavia. As fun as it would be to parade Soviet aircraft around as a sort of trophy, there are a few problems that arise when a foreign-owned aircraft lands itself in American hands. Not only is the aircraft still the property of its home country, but if word got out that we were uncovering all of the Soviet Union's fighter secrets, that would drive them to change up their design and tactic philosophies. This of course would make most, if not all, of what we learn null and void. Any further Eastern Bloc aircraft in American hands would have to be kept away from prying eyes in an area that would allow for better evaluation. What better place than Groom Lake would house them? Moving forward, captured MiGs would be shipped to Nevada, and if their acquisition were clandestine enough, they wouldn't have to leave. In 1967, a MiG-21 fishbed was delivered to the US after its Iraqi pilot, Munir Redfa, defected to Israel. The defection as part of Operation Diamond was the third attempt headed by the Israeli Mossad to capture the most advanced Russian aircraft of the day. The fishbed, redubbed YF-110 Have Donut, was sent to Groom Lake for evaluation. By now, the US was embroiled in the Vietnam War, where pilots were regularly encountering Soviet-built MiG-17s, 19s, and 21s. The evaluation of Have Donut revealed that the MiG-21 was a force to be reckoned with, concurring with the experience gained from the American encounters with the type in Vietnam. The MiG-21 was built around a Tumansky R-25 turbojet spitting out 15,000 pounds of thrust with afterburner. Such a massive engine in a small package drove the fishbed to Mach 2, allowing it to keep pace with the equivalent Western fighters of the day. Soviet doctrine of the time emphasized pilots obeying commands from ground control intercept stations to make intercepts and then immediately return to home. In short, the MiGs would be vectored by their GCIs to an intercept point where they would release their missiles and use their speed to evade any counterattacks. They were not really trained to go toe-to-toe with Western fighters in a sustained turning fight. Now, these hit-and-run tactics worked extremely well when, in Vietnam specifically, they were paired with our next subject, the MiG-17. The older MiG-17 Fresco was used to great effect in Vietnam and the Middle Eastern conflicts of the 1960s. Unlike the MiG-21 that was turned over in a defection, a Syrian MiG-17 Fresco was sent to Groom Lake after it mistakenly landed in Israel. The Fresco was also given a codename, Have Drill, and joined the growing adversary fleet. Have Drill yielded remarkable results when used in mock dogfights against American pilots. It was able to defeat any American aircraft in their first flight. The evaluation determined that overconfidence and a lack of dogfighting training played to the MiG pilot's advantage. The Fresco, an old design by 1968, was underestimated by many American pilots, who would then fall for the fighter's advantages. Good nose pointability at low speeds, a small profile making it hard to see, and the ability to pull sustained 8G turns. Unlike Korea, our pilots hadn't been properly trained to fight in a turn-and-burn dogfight, and our attrition rates rose to an unacceptable level when fighting the North Vietnamese Air Force. As I covered in my F4 video, despite having the means to engage targets beyond the visual range in the Vietnam conflict, they were forced to get in close to visually identified targets. This quickly developed into close-in knife fights. What it comes down to is that American pilots weren't as trained to get up close with the more primitive Soviet MiGs, and it bit them in the ass. Of course, the captured MiGs helped remedy that problem. When the US Navy Fighter Weapons School was formed in 1969, the data from Have Drill and Have Donut were vital in forming the syllabus. Evaluation of the MiG-17 found that it shared similar flight characteristics to the A-4 Skyhawk, prompting the Fighter Weapons School to employ the Little Scooter as a MiG-17 simulator en masse. Likewise, a MiG-21 analog was found in the F-5. The two American jets would go on to become the iconic Top Gun aggressors in the coming years. Colonel Gale Peck later proposed a more structured training regime employing the now growing number of Soviet aircraft in Groom Lake's inventory. He spearheaded the training program dubbed Constant Peg. In 1977, the US Air Force formed the 6513th Test Squadron, a unit that was to test the limits of Soviet aircraft, evaluate their performance, and essentially write manuals on them to facilitate operational use of the aircraft. After evaluation, the MiGs would be turned over to Tactical Air Command's 4477th Test and Evaluation Program, the Red Eagles, who would then act as aggressors for the US Air Force and Navy pilots. Constant Peg aimed to allow US Air Force pilots to dogfight with the Soviet aircraft in realistic scenarios. Several MiG-17s came from Morocco, and a few more Algerian MiG-21s were acquired in the Middle East. The 1970s saw a new generation of Soviet fighters coming into service, most notably the MiG-23, NATO codename Flogger. And of course, the Americans had to have one too. Now I want to go over some of the traits that made the MiG-21 popular among Eastern Bloc countries. The MiG-21 was cheap to buy and cheap to maintain. Hell, you can buy an early fish bed for less than a BMP-1. I can literally go out and purchase a MiG-21 in flying condition for less than $250,000 right now. I mean, of course, you do have to factor in, operating costs, and with today's standards, that would roughly come out to about $10,000 per flight hour, but I think my point still stands. Keep that Patreon money coming, folks. In addition to being affordable, the MiG-21 could carry a multitude of weapons and was, generally speaking, not too difficult to fly. For many Eastern Bloc air forces, this was important because their pilots often didn't receive the flight hours Western pilots had. As long as they flew the MiG within its performance envelope, its only real drawback was a high takeoff and landing speed. This poses a problem for many Eastern countries that lack an infrastructure to amass prepared airstrips. When designing the next MiG to be, Mikhail Gurevich took that into account. Two solutions were afforded to them. One, put lift jets into the body of the aircraft. This would end up being a dead end for development because you'd then be carrying around several tons of dead weight in your aircraft that would slow you down. NATO came up with a pretty apt codename for this failed bird, Faithless. Idea number 2 made a bit more sense for the day. Variable geometry. Variable geometry was a pretty popular concept in the latter half of the 20th century. NATO nations including Britain and Germany developed the Tornado series, the French developed the Mirage G, even though it didn't enter service, and of course the United States developed the F-111 Aardvark and the F-14 Tomcat, my favorite. The Soviets, keeping a watchful eye on Western aircraft development, first toyed with swing-wing technology on their Su-17, an evolution of the Su-7 fitter ground attack platform. The Sukhoi design had a hinged outer wing which negated the need to develop articulating hardpoints, as the weapons could be kept inboard. A true full swing wing would be implemented on the MiG-23, which, in all fairness, did reduce the takeoff and landing roll. Because it was meant to operate from poor runways, the 23, NATO codename Flogger, even featured mudguards on the robust landing gear it packed. As the first MiG intended to add beyond visual range tactics to its repertoire, the Flogger was to be fitted with a massive radar, the Sapphire 23 series. Of course, the larger size of the aircraft warranted a power plant with enough smash to get it to Mach 2. The Tumansky R-29 turbojet was born, a massive engine which, in theory, could offer 22,000 pounds of thrust with the can lit, rivaling that of the American J-79 used by the F-4 Phantom. Like most Russian equipment, a lot of this sounded great on paper, but the reality of the Flogger would soon be revealed to the Americans earlier than expected. It was late September 1977. Jimmy Carter was the President of the United States. The Voyager 2 probe was on its way to the depths of space. Star Wars was becoming a cultural phenomenon, and a US Air Force C-5 Galaxy was en route to a secret base in Egypt. Upon landing at the clandestine airfield operated by Egyptian Air Force personnel, the C-5 was brought to a large aircraft hangar. Within the hangar was wrapped a pallet, a gift from the Egyptian government to the CIA. 5 years prior, Egyptian President Anwar al-Sadat had ousted the Soviet influence from his country. The political reasoning for the move is outside the scope of this video, but before the breakup of Egyptian and Soviet relations, the Egyptian Air Force was supplied with the MiG-23 MS variant. The MS was an export version of the Flogger, and while it lacked more of the sophisticated Soviet avionics and countermeasures, it was still the most advanced aircraft fielded by Egypt at the time. So you can imagine what was wrapped up like a present and loaded onto the C-5. The gargantuan Galaxy took off before dawn, bound for the Nevada desert. Safe and sound at Groom Lake, the package was rolled out, time to avoid Soviet satellite overflights. Once secured, the Red Hats unwrapped their new toy, a pristine MiG-23 MS Flogger. Now, with the most advanced Soviet fighter in their possession, the Red Hats began their evaluation. What they discovered about the MiG-23 was rather surprising. Long story short, it wasn't very good. Variable geometry has always been a maintenance nightmare for ground crews. It's part of the reason why we don't have the F-14 or F-111 around anymore. While it did allow for lower landing speeds than the MiG-21, maintaining a wing box in the MiG-23 added countless hours of manpower that Eastern Bloc countries just could not afford. Despite the swing wing capabilities which allowed for improved high-speed characteristics, initial fears that the MiG-23 was superior and a turn to Western fighters were snuffed. As it turned out, the Flogger's performance was akin to that of the F-4 Phantom, which by this point was being replaced by the F-15 and F-16. The Sapphire 23 radar also lacked the range of the F-4's AN/APQ-120. With a range of about 13 miles versus the F-4's 50 or so miles, Soviet radar technology still lagged behind the Western world. Of course, there are many factors that go into radar range and the employment of such systems, and yes, the MiG-23 still relied on ground control intercept to guide to a target, But the MiG almost had hallmarks of a late 1950s era Western aircraft versus a frontline fighter of the 1970s. Continuing the comparison of the F-4, the MiG-23s carried less ordnance and could only pack 4 air-to-air missiles versus the Phantom's 8. The Flogger was also a handful to fly in a dogfight. You think the F-104 was an easy plane to depart? American Red Air pilots resorted to painting a white line in the MiG's cockpit as a guide to crank the flight stick to in the event of a departure. But at the end of the day, the MiG-23 could at least stand by the stereotypical Soviet archetype of being rugged, huh? Nah, not really. The early MiG-23s especially had, for a lack of a better term, breakable engines. While it allowed the MiG-23 to out-accelerate a Phantom in a straight line, the R-29 was an extremely hot-running engine and would smoke profusely when not in burner. The fragile engine also had a nasty tendency to shatter itself in a spin, something the MiG-23 often found itself in, causing fan blades to snap off and rip through the turbines like razor blades in a blender. Granted, this was a problem allegedly remedied with later R-29 variants, but the hallmark ease of maintenance was further driven into the ground as the entirety of the Flogger had to be separated in two in order to pull the friggin' engine out. Oh, and if that wasn't bad enough, the R-29 engines were only made to last around 150 hours. Not just for an overhaul, mind you, but for a complete replacement. The Soviet Union really didn't see this as a problem because any of its allies utilizing the MiG-23 would have to run back and buy more replacement engines. So, we have a Soviet fighter following decade-old conventions, offering zilch in the way of innovation, is a maintenance nightmare, and constantly breaks itself if you breathe on it wrong. To top it all off, it couldn't even pack much heat when it did make it to the fight. No wonder over 100 Floggers have been shot down worldwide when they only achieved 25 kills in a 50-year period. That's a 1-4 kill ratio. To be frank, that is an absolutely dismal career. In fact, most Soviet aircraft have an adverse kill ratio, but that's an even bigger story. My buddy Animarchy History has been working on a deep dive into the entirety of Russian aviation history going back to before World War I. It's a hell of a project, and I definitely suggest checking that out if you want to learn more. The Nevada Desert continued to play host to foreign technology throughout the Cold War, with the 65 13th Squadron performing evaluations and the 44 77th Red Eagles applying the Red Hats' data in dissimilar air combat training. When the Cold War ended, the Red Hats were disestablished. Officially, anyway. As of the 2000s, the 413th Test Squadron has been up to, well, that certainly looks like a flanker, doesn't it? It seems the 4th generation fighters like the MiG-29 and Su-27 have been regularly operated out of Groom Lake. Indeed, Russian aircraft are easier to come by after the fall of the Soviet Union. Who knows what might be hiding behind the desert sands? Well, I've been doing some digging, and let me tell you, you would not believe what I found. Check this out. Oh my god! Guys, be cool! Ah,
Tase him!
don't tase me, bro!
Okay, I got him. I'll get secured and ready for transport. Secure that evidence!
What's this paint on the wall?
Keep the sun.
At your back?
Alright, so they let me have one phone call, so I'm gonna use it to thank my Ace of Aces tier on Patreon, so here we go! Shockwave, FB, Weefy, Chris Quinn, Deuce, Pecops, Chuck45, Jake Fuentes, Tico, Captain Fantastic, the Administrator, Iron, and Kodai. Okay, so bail is set for about 25,000. If we band together, we can... April 23rd, 1917. A gargantuan Zeppelin launches from Tonner, Denmark. Bearing the Iron Cross, the German airship L-23 had seen plenty of action by this point in the war, having struck England 3 times in bombing raids. L-23's mission today would be different, however. for she was to patrol the North Sea, interdict any Allied shipping, and send it to the bottom. Commander Ludwig Brockholt would go after shipping lanes, yes, but today, he wasn't just going to sink his enemy. Today, we're stepping aboard Zeppelin L-23 as it seizes Norwegian ship Royal. Oxford Dictionary defines piracy as the practice of attacking and robbing ships at sea. Almost as far back as sailing ships first slid into the water, lowly criminals and adversary warships roamed the seas of antiquity for prey. Typically, merchant vessels transporting supplies and even riches were choice targets for pirates. The golden age of piracy from the mid-1600s to the early 18th century saw pirate activity across the globe as international trade was becoming a reality. This is where you see the romanticized sailing ships broadsiding one another with dashing men boarding and scrapping it out. Of course, it was never quite that glamorous. Now, this era is a little outside of my wheelhouse, but I definitely recommend checking out the YouTube channel Walk the Plank for more information. He does an excellent job explaining the truths of pirate life back in the day via high-quality videos, and I definitely think he's worth a watch. On that note, there were also government-backed pirates known as privateers, who were tasked with capturing merchant vessels of hostile nations. As such, they had to abide by certain rules of the sea and couldn't go after their own ships. A privateer could be a private citizen given permission from their own government to claim prizes, but prizes could also be claimed by proper naval vessels, and the payout distributed amongst the crew. In order to properly capture a vessel by prize rules, most nations decreed that unarmed merchant vessels were to not be fired upon unless they did not stop when prompted. If the ship were to either be captured or destroyed by the privateer, they were responsible for proper treatment of the crew, either allowing them to disembark via lifeboat if close to shore, or even just letting them off in a port. By the late 19th century, most nations had abolished legalized privateering, decreeing that naval captains and crews would no longer be paid out prize money. That being said, the basic concept of prize rules would evolve into cruiser rules, which, though the naval crews were not to receive any personal cash-outs, they would still be responsible for the freighter crew's safety. As World War I started in 1914, cruiser rules were still recognized by the Allied and Central Powers. A naval vessel could not engage an unarmed merchant ship of another nation unless the crew had disembarked or were taken aboard the attacking vessel. This would change as the war developed and submarines got into the mix, but generally speaking, by 1917, cruiser rules were still followed to an extent, and not just by surface ships. While the idea of an airship being a frontline weapon is absurd to us in the 2020s, they were a very common sight in the 1910s. Most navies of the world had rigid airships, including Great Britain and, yes, of course, the German Empire. Now, these things weren't what we call blimps now. Zeppelins have a rigid metal frame that suspends hydrogen bags within them. On the contrary, blimps are essentially airbags that keep their shape via air pressure. For a long time, going back to the 1890s, Zeppelins were seen as the most efficient method of air travel before the airplane was invented. Zeppelins were initially used to transport mail and passengers over land and sea alike. It didn't take long until military applications were conceptualized for these massive air-going ships. Now, these things weren't like the old observation balloons of old for spotting artillery. These could be maneuvered and fly over pretty much any territory unimpeded. Airships were also big enough to carry early radio sets, allowing better communication with the ground. Eventually, turret and machine guns were fitted to Zeppelins purchased by the German Army and Navy. The first Navy Zeppelin, L-1, entered service in October 1912. Zeppelin production increased as the war broke out in Europe. The Germans carried out some of the first strategic bombing missions in history with Zeppelins when London was bombed throughout 1915 and 1916. Air defenses of the time were not suited for intercepting a Zeppelin, until higher velocity AA artillery and higher flying planes like the Sopwith Pup came onto the scene. In response, the Q-class Zeppelin was introduced, a lengthened version of the older P-class with an additional gas bag held within. The additional hydrogen allowed the Q-class to cruise to 12,000 feet with a 2-ton bomb load. The 23rd German Navy Zeppelin, originally designated LZ-66 by the Zeppelin Corporation, was dubbed L-23 and introduced on April 8, 1916. L-23 was armed with no less than 8 MG-08 machine guns and could carry 4,000 pounds of bombs at a slick 50 knots. That might be slow by today's standards, but back then when most surface ships could barely make 30 knots and planes were topping out at just over 100, 50 is not a bad clip. Another benefit to airships is that they can stop in midair and hover. Keep that in mind, that'll be important soon. L-23 was involved in 3 air raids over England from 1916 to 1917, but her crowning moment would occur over the North Sea in April. In charge of the Zeppelin was Commander Ludwig Bockholt. Bockholt had been in the German Navy since 1903, primarily serving on surface ships until transferring to airships in 1916. Taking command of L-23 in March 1917, Bockholt had already experienced the inherent challenges that came with captaining an airship. He had already lost one airship, L-57, as it prepared to deliver supplies to beleaguered German forces in Africa. Now this loss wasn't combat related, as heavy wind gusts in Jüterbog, Germany practically threw L-57 in the midst of trying to get the thing back in a hangar. As it was tossed in the wind, a fire sparked and the vessel, along with all the cargo destined for Africa, was lost. Even so, Bockholt wasn't deterred from his duty and was reassigned to L-23. On April 23, 1917, Bockholt took L-23 north of Horns Rift, Denmark. What he and his crew found was a lone sailing vessel flying the Norwegian flag. Norway was neutral in the Great War, but that doesn't mean they weren't making money on it. Royal was a three-masted bark built in 1881. At this point in history, steam-powered had revolutionized trade, but it wasn't uncommon to come across conventional sail-driven vessels still. Vessels like Royal were commonly used to ferry supplies to either side of the war by neutral parties, and by 1917, the majority of Scandinavian nations were starting to send more supplies to the Allies versus the Central Powers. Knowing this, Bockholt circled the merchant vessel. So the cruiser rules still applied to airships just as they did surface vessels. With that knowledge, it didn't prevent warning shots from being fired in an attempt to stop the merchant ship. Lacking naval cannons, L-23 still had a 2-ton bomb load, and it released a few across Royal's bow. The ensuing explosion stopped the Norwegian crew in their tracks. L-23 lowered its altitude as it found Royal carried no weapons, only to find a rowboat coming to meet the Zeppelin, which slowly hovered down to wave height in a silent descent. The Norwegian crewmen who surrendered to Bockholt bore a manifest revealing lumber bound for Britain. Royal was supplying the enemy and thus was a valid target. This put Bockholt in a very interesting position. Royal was being surrendered, and it's all been under fair game by this point, but it wasn't as simple as just sinking the bark, as cruiser rules required the crew to be cared for. Now, L-23 did not have the means to take prisoners, and it just did not have the room for them, but another idea was posed by the commander. Regardless of serving aboard a Zeppelin, L-23's crew was made up entirely of sailors who had gone through the same basic naval training that seagoing guys had. As this was the early 20th century, their training included instructions on operating a rigged vessel. 3 of L-23's crew were put aboard Royal to guide her to the German naval pickets nearby. The 19th century sailing vessel was taken as a prize for the German Empire, with Zeppelin L-23 casting her ominous shadow across her rigging as she was turned over to the surface fleet. For the first and only time in history, an airship had successfully captured a merchant vessel. While the Zeppelin's crew weren't awarded a prize payout as far as my research has found, the German government sold Royal to a German petroleum company called, Deutschen Petroleumwirtschaftsges. Leave a comment criticizing my German pronunciation. The act of air privateering was a huge morale booster in the German Navy, but an order was put in place to prevent the act from being repeated. It makes sense, honestly. While Bockholt's actions were unprecedented, it also required him to practically dip his Zeppelin into the frigid water of the North Sea. And that's in piss and distance of a neutral vessel, which really wasn't hauling anything that valuable. German high command feared overzealous Zeppelin commanders might try to repeat the stunt and get their asses shot off by a Q-ship or something, so Bockholt was let off with a pat on the back, and since then, no naval vessel has been captured by an airship. But what happened to L-23, Bockholt, and Royal? Royal would go on serving the post-war German merchant fleet into the 1920s, acting as a transport vessel for various companies before being broken up in 1925 or so. Bockholt would be transferred to LZ-104, also known as L-59 for the Navy. On April 7, 1918, almost a year since the taking of Royal, L-59 was seen exploding in midair in transit to strike targets at Malta by a German submarine. None of the Zeppelin's 21 crewmen survived the accident, including Bockholt. L-23 itself wouldn't survive World War I either. In August of 17, a Royal Navy squadron returning from a mine-laying mission spotted L-23 patrolling at low altitude. HMS Yarmouth, a town-class cruiser in the formation, featured a rudimentary catapult system atop one of her gun turrets. The makeshift aircraft carrier launched a lone Sopwith pup flown by Royal Naval Aviator Bernard Smart, who climbed after the fleeing Zeppelin. Building a 3,000-foot advantage on the massive airship, Smart dove his little pup on the behemoth. The Sopwith pup was the precursor to the later and more powerful Camel. While the Camel is often cited as being an unstable platform for new pilots, the pup was easier to handle and its light weight allowed it to operate from warship catapults. That being said, the pup only had one Vickers machine gun mounted forward in front of the pilot. It's incredible to think that a single machine gun could whack a Zeppelin, but Smart had a full load of incendiary ammunition in his belt. At this point in the war, incendiary ammunition made short work of Zeppelins, given their gas bags were full of flammable hydrogen, and Smart lit the thing up. The small Navy fighter ran its gun across the aft end of L-23, igniting volatile fuel and turning it into a falling fireball. Smart would end up ditching his pup alongside the Royal Navy squadron as no means of landing were available in the pre-flat top days. He'd be rescued and be awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his actions against the Zeppelin. As L-59 claimed the entirety of its crew, L-23 did the same. Even a lone gunner, Johann Schuttrup, who bailed out from the falling behemoth, met his fate in the icy North waters, his body being found in September of that year. Pirates are still an occasional occurrence around the world in places like East Africa, but L-23's taking of Royal has never been repeated. Zeppelins would fall out of favor as aircraft evolved, with the final nail in rigid airships being the destruction of Hindenburg in 1937. You'll see the occasional blimp out and about, but the classic Art Deco days of the early 20th century are long gone. Now, I know a certain reformer is a vocal advocate for airships, though, and there is talk of bringing back airships for various duties, but they're not going to be doing much bombing. Well, never say never, I guess. If it turns out a Goodyear blimp drops bombs in a future war, I will deep fry and eat my sunglasses. I mean, hell, we're seeing the return of prop jobs with rear gunners that take out drones in Ukraine, so, well, I guess we'll leave it at that. Nuclear weapons are the most destructive devices ever composed by mankind. Able to wipe cities off the map with the push of a button, ballistic missiles carrying nuclear warheads have maintained the dual role of deterrence ever since their debut in the 1950s. The means of delivering nuclear missiles has varied through the years, be they from fixed launchers, silos, or even submarines. What few know of, however, is the airborne application of the Minuteman missile. In 1974, an experiment was conducted with the largest airlift platform in the American inventory. Its goal was to evaluate the feasibility of launching a Minuteman missile from a C-5 Galaxy. Was the test successful? Are we packing ballistic missiles in cargo planes today? All this and more coming right up. The LGM-30 Minuteman series of missiles has its roots in the Second World War. The first true ballistic missile was developed by the Third Reich. Designed as the A-4, the missile was better known as the V-2, and was launched into suborbital arcs to strike Allied cities like London and Antwerp. Germany wasn't the only nation working on ballistic missiles. By the latter days of World War II, Belgian-born scientist Karel Bossart was actively developing his own missile design inspired by the V-2, which was projected to have enough smash to get it across the Atlantic Ocean. Remember Bossart, he'll be important later. Anyway, 1945 rolled around and the first use of atomic bombs against the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war and brought about the nuclear age. With the defeat of the Axis, the two superpowers of the United States and the Soviet Union found themselves as the two big kids on the block, and both wanted a nuclear arsenal. As the 1940s gave way to the 1950s, delivery of nuclear weapons was relegated to intercontinental bombers like the B-29 Superfortress, Tu-4 Bull, and of course, the right hand of the US Air Force's Strategic Air Command, the Convair B-36 Peacemaker. Sorry, I just really like that airplane. Now, bombers are really cool, and a vital asset for any superpower, but the ability for a large aircraft to get through enemy air defenses was coming into question as improved anti-aircraft technology sprouted up. Radar-guided AAA and brand new surface-to-air missiles such as the American Nike and the Soviet S-25 Berkut could, in theory, knock down the high-flying but slow propeller-driven bombers. Not to mention, as jet technology improved, the threat of interceptors also had to be overcome. In the Korean War, B-29 bombers fell victim to MiG-15 attacks. The once untouchable superfortresses of World War II vintage were easily slaughtered by the communist fighters, and by war's end, 16 forts were down by MiG cannon fire and at least 4 to AAA. So there was doubt that bombers could fulfill the nuclear mission alone. The US Army at this time saw land-based missiles in a similar role to their World War II counterparts, to be used as long-range artillery. The problem with missiles at this time was that the majority of them were launched from fixed launchers and were thus exposed to enemy attacks. Not to mention, liquid fuel was the primary source of powering early ballistic missiles, which were still too small to carry a nuclear warhead anyway. Early missiles like the Redstone, which was a direct development of the V-2, were also relatively short-ranged. Unlike bombers that had an intercontinental reach, land-based missiles couldn't achieve orbit and were thus relegated intermediate-ranged roles. At the time, you were looking at about 250 miles of smash if you were lucky. So ballistic missiles were a dead end, right? Our boy Carol Bossart, who I mentioned before, had been developing improvements to missile technology all the way through the 1940s and 50s. Now affiliated with the Convair Aircraft Company, Bossart was promoted to chief designer of Project Atlas, the first real attempt to construct an intercontinental ballistic missile which was powerful enough to lob a nuclear warhead into space. As opposed to the Redstone family, which was composed of multiple fuel tanks within an outer casing, Bossart proposed that the outer casing of the missile itself could be the nitrogen and kerosene propellant tank. As long as the propellant stage of the missile was kept pressurized, it would keep enough structural rigidity to stay together until the warhead could separate in space. This saved on weight, allowing the upper stage to actually achieve orbit, and thus a true intercontinental ballistic missile was born. Known as the SM-65, the Atlas fell not to the Army's inventory, but the US Air Force's SAC, as another tool to deliver a nuclear weapon into the Kremlin's mailbox. Of course, the Atlas wasn't perfect. It still had the issue of being launched from a static tower and took time for fueling. The nitrogen pressurization was also a point of contention, for if the rocket depressurized, it wouldn't have enough integrity to hold together on the pad, which, for example, resulted in the loss of an Agena launch vehicle in 1963. Its implementation was not to be a first strike weapon, but for secondary strikes after the initial bomber attacks. The Air Force still sought a more expedient and survivable solution. The Atlas missile gave way to the more powerful Titan series in the mid-1960s. With Titan came the ability to store the missile in an underground silo. The Titan still had the drawback of using liquid fuel, however, which needed to be pumped into the missile before firing. While the Titan II series allowed this process to take place within minutes, an alternative to the highly toxic chemicals was found in solid fuel. Now, your boy Falcon here is no chemist and I can hardly pronounce half of the shit that goes into rocket fuel, but I do know that solid rocket propellant is much safer to handle and can be stored for extended periods. Solid propellant had already been used for years on smaller rockets. Its real drawback is that it can't really be throttled. Once it's lit, it's going to keep burning until it runs out. For things like aircraft, artillery, and anti-tank rockets, this really isn't that much of a problem whatsoever. Initially, the Air Force conceptualized solid fuel rockets to take on the medium-range role of the Redstone, but Colonel Edward Hall felt that an intercontinental missile could be propelled by such a fuel. Hall, a World War II veteran who was responsible for capturing V-2 rocket intelligence after the conflict, felt that solid propellants could offer a quick reaction time in the event of a nuclear exchange, one even faster than the Titan missile offered. So, Colonel Hall went to work, formulating a concept of missile farms, a self-sustaining environment where missiles could be assembled from factory shipments, maintained, stored in silos, and even recycled at the end of their lifespan. If a missile were to reach the end of its storage life, it could easily be swapped out with a replacement. All this, and the missiles could be fired within seconds should the balloon go up. Reduction of weight, cost, and form factor were the priorities when designing the new missile. Tipped with a W-56 or 59 warhead, Minuteman I could reliably land within 2 clicks of any designated target in the Soviet Union thanks to an Aeronautics D-17 computer guidance system. Unlike liquid-fueled rockets that could adjust in flight to make corrections, the Minuteman could open vents to decrease thrust as needed at its apogee to reliably hit its mark. At the missile's peak of deployment, over 1,000 Minutemen dotted the American countryside. Ellsworth, South Dakota, Minot, North Dakota, F.E. Warren in Wyoming, and Whiteman in Missouri all played home to the new missiles, which were guarded round the clock by security police forces. In addition to land-based Minutemen, the US Navy around this time developed the Polaris series of missiles for their submarine forces. For the first time, America had a true nuclear triad in the form of bombers, land-based, and submarine-based weapons. Of course, an air-launched ballistic missile was still a pipe dream, as the AGM-48 Skybolt program had been cancelled in 1962. The program would have seen suborbital ballistic missiles fired from B-52s and Avro Vulcans. Interestingly, the Skybolt shared the same warhead with the Minuteman. In the early 1970s, the idea of an air-launched ballistic missile was still floating in the Air Force's head, but what aircraft could even carry, let alone launch something like a Minuteman in flight? Alright, so we're switching gears for a bit. In the world of military cargo aircraft, you have two philosophies: tactical and strategic airlifting. Tactical airlift encompasses smaller cargo planes like the C-130 Hercules or A-400 Atlas, which can carry a platoon of troops and maybe a couple light vehicles. Tactical airlifters can typically operate from unprepared airfields to deliver assets to the front. Now, the C-130 is a pretty big plane, but I say smaller because, well, here's what a strategic airlifter looks like next to one. This big fucking thing is the C-5 Galaxy, the largest aircraft in the US Air Force's inventory. This is a strategigic airlifter, meant to ship in vital and heavy assets to a theater. The C-5 can haul up to 81 passengers and 2 UH-1 Hueys or M1A1 main battle tanks. To give you an idea of the scale of this beast, the wingspan of the Galaxy is 223 feet, which is almost double that of the Wright brothers' first flight. Only the Ukrainian Antonov 225 surpassed the Galaxy in size, but keep in mind, there was only one, while the US Air Force maintains at least 50 C-5s. While we're here, let's pour one out for the Dream, though. The Russians destroying her cut down an important piece of aviation history. But hey, if all goes well, the Ukrainian government wants to rebuild her. Cheers to that. Anyway, back to the Galaxy. The C-5 was envisioned as a replacement for the Douglas C-131 Cargo Master in the early 1960s. Several companies came forth with proposals, but the Lockheed Aircraft Company's design was selected in 1964. Lockheed already had extensive experience with heavy lift aircraft, notably their legendary C-130 and C-141. In fact, the C-141's overall configuration was a good starting point for the much larger C-5, featuring an opening nose and T-tail design. Despite some early teething and development issues, the C-5 entered service in 1970. Until the C-5 entered service, the only aircraft able to haul the Minuteman missile was the C-141, which was actually designed to allow a single missile container to slide into its cargo bay. While I couldn't find any information on how many missiles the C-5 can carry at once, the Air Force did do something funny with the gigantic plane. October 24th, 1974. A lone C-5 of the 65 12th Test Squadron took off, bound for the Pacific Test Range. Within its hold was a modified Minuteman I strapped to a series of pallets. The goal of the test was to evaluate the feasibility of dropping missiles from C-5s in anticipation of the Minuteman's replacement, the Peacekeeper, then known as the MX program. Note, this test was not to just drop a missile under parachute for delivery. No. After the C-5 was clear of the parachutes, the pallets would slip away and the missile's booster would ignite. And that's exactly what happened. A ballistic missile successfully dropped from a cargo plane, powered up in flight, and had an engine burn of 10 seconds before falling into the sea. The C-5 was capable of launching nuclear missiles. And they never did it again! I mean, let's think about it. As awesome as it is, an air-mobile Minuteman isn't the most practical mode of delivering a warhead. The Air Force decided that bombers packing low-altitude cruise missiles and land-based arrows were more efficient than having vital airlift assets on constant readiness for a nuclear launch. That being said, there's nothing really keeping the stunt from being repeated. And in my book, that makes the C-5 Galaxy the deadliest aircraft in our inventory in a weird, roundabout way, and that's pretty cool. As we close out my second year of doing aviation history videos, I want to thank my partner in crime, Hellion, once more for helping me get this channel rolling with their amazing art. In addition, my lovely patrons have lined my wallet enough to keep a roof over my head. A special thanks goes out to my Ace of Aces tier. You guys really are the real G's. Special thanks to Captain Fantastic, Chuck45, Deuce, Ghoul, Iron, Jake Fuentes, Kodai, Chris Quinn, Peckops, Private Petey, Shockwave, Tico, and last but never least, Weefy. You guys have a good one, and keep that sun at your back.